Good evening and welcome to the Monday, February 24th, 2020 Plan Commission and Commission for Citizen Involvement. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Iris, would you please call the roll?
Beckett is excused. Fisher?
Here.
Heap?
Here.
Pepe?
Here.
Semler?
Here.
Stewart?
Here.
Whitman?
Here.
Thank you. We have quorum. First on the agenda is citizen comment. We don't have anybody here who would like to make citizen comment, so we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is minutes. These are the minutes from January 27th, 2020. Commissioners, any comments or requested changes?
I make a motion to adopt.
The motion is there a second?
Second.
The motion and a second. All those in favor of approving the minutes for January 27th, 2020?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'm abstaining
Abstain.
because I wasn't here for that meeting.
So we have 4 yays and 2 abstains. 5.
Oh,
No, 4 yays and 2 abstains. Yes.
Who was the other abstain?
me.
Phil
Me.
and Commissioner Pepe.
I abstain.
Okay, thank you.
Minutes are approved. Next on the agenda is the Commission for Citizen Involvement, general updates. I didn't have any updates that I wanted to make tonight. Commissioners, any other updates? None? So we'll move on to the first item on our agenda, which is finding conclusions and order. This is the Community Code Development Amendments related to R6 Structure Design Standards, LU 19-0038. Public testimony will not be accepted tonight. And on February 10th, 2020, the Plan Commission made a preliminary recommendation that the City Council approve the proposed code amendments and directed staff to return with draft findings, conclusions, and order. The staff coordinator is Ellen Davis, Associated Planner. Director Siegel, any opening comments that staff would like to make?
No, thank you, Chair. The findings reflect the fact that there was no testimony in opposition to the proposal. The Commission recommended approval.
Thank you, Director Siegel. I'd also like to add that I was absent on that night, but I did watch the video of the meeting. So I'm aware of the staff report and all the input from the commission. Any comments commissioners would like to make, or is there a motion?
Motion to approve.
Second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? None? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
So 1 abstain and 5 ayes. Any nays? None? So the motion is approved. And next on the agenda is a public hearing. This is the Historic Preservation Community Development Code Amendments, LU 19-0008. Public testimony is accepted. 5 minutes per individual applies. This is a request from the City of Lake Oswego to amend LOC 12.51.035, the Historic Resources Advisory Board, LOC 50.01.001, the title and purpose, LOC 50.01.003, Authority, LOC 50.06.009, Historic Preservation, LOC 50.07.001, the Summary and Procedures, LOC 50.07.002, List of Decision Makers, LOC 50.07.003, Review Procedures, 50.07.004, Additional Submission Requirements, LOC 50.10.003, Definitions, and adding new language to address demolition by neglect. The staff coordinator is Paul Espy, Associate Planner. Paul, would you like to give us introduction?
Before he does that, let me just read into the record the
Sure.
process, even though we don't have any members of the public process here. Oh, I'm sorry. This is a legislative decision, which is generally a policy decision within the discretion of the City Council. The Planning Commission will review the legislative proposal, make a recommendation to the City Council. Although our legislative decision may be discretionary, it must also comply with any applicable state law as well as any applicable statewide planning goal or administrative rule adopted pursuant to ORS Chapter 190. A legislative amendment to the Community Development Code must also comply with any applicable provision of the Lake Oswego Comprehensive Plan. The public hearing process will begin with a presentation by staff, and testimony will be received from the public. Individuals will be allowed up to 5 minutes. Recognized neighborhood associations, homeowner associations, government agencies, or other incorporated public interest organizations will be allowed up to 10 minutes. The time limits do not include time spent by questions from the commission or responses to such questions. Testimony by attorneys, representatives, and witnesses on behalf of or which are part of the presentation by a person shall be counted within that person's time limit. Any person in attendance may cede his or her time for testimony to another person, but in no case shall any person's testimony be increased to greater than 10 minutes. At this point, I would ask the commission members to please declare if you have any financial conflicts of interest. Mr. Whitman?
No.
Assembly?
None.
No.
No.
None.
Okay, thank you. Associate Planner Paul Espy with the staff report.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the commission, good evening. My name is Paul Espy. I'm with the Long Range Planning Department. I will be doing the presentation for the Preservation Code amendments. I have with me this evening Shar Green, who is our chair of the Historic Resources Advisory Board. And she has participated in the work sessions and discussion with other HRAB members and the process for putting together all of the code revisions that you have before you this evening. And we have before us this evening the proposed revisions to the elements of the Historic Preservation Code, Chapter 50, 06, 009, and other sections that relate to the powers and duties of the Historic Resources Advisory Board and other land use procedures related to historic preservation. The staff report and attachment outlines a fairly extensive number of amendments for this public hearing, and we'd like to seek overall guidance and support from the Planning Commission on major policy items identified in the staff report and this evening's presentation. And I've identified those as policy items in the report and this presentation, so we should be able to kind of follow the bouncing ball fairly easily on this. That being said, I'd like to try to get through as much of the presentation as possible, saving the questions for the end. But if you do have questions as we're going along, I know there's a lot of material and it'd be hard to remember all of them, until the end. So you can kind of, at your discretion, ask questions at any given time. And so after the 4 work sessions with the Historic Resources Advisory Board and 2 with the Planning Commission, we are now ready to hold the first public hearing with the Planning Commission. The main goals are to facilitate the process of historic designation and to help homeowners and contractors comply with the preservation requirements, improve efficiency in processing applications for historic remodels, maintain integrity of historic landmarks, of course. And while doing all that, we are achieving consistency with the Oregon Model Historic Preservation Ordinance, or the Model Code, which is an attachment to the staff report, and also the Oregon Administrative Rule, or the revised rule that was adopted. The revisions of that rule were adopted in January 2017 and were related to National Register properties, the Goal 5, how Goal 5 applies to National Register properties. So strategies for facilitating historic designation would include providing a standardized process for conducting historic property surveys, clarifying the criteria for the designation of a historic resource, which includes owner consent provisions pursuant to ORS 197-772. We've made it very clear that a property owner or a property cannot be designated unless the property owner has consented to that designation. So they have to sign an application before any kind of a designation occurs. I just wanted to make sure that folks understood that. This also incorporates new National Register criteria for evaluating significance of a historic resource designation. And then we also proposed a simplification to the code to remove the ESEE criterion from historic designation and added it as a requirement for the designation removal. And we've considered that the environmental significance, and we consolidated the environmental significance criteria with the historic and architectural significance criteria. Before, you considered 3 different criteria. It was environmental, architectural, and historic significance. And there were so many parts of the environmental criteria that mimicked or were very close to either architectural or historic criteria that it made sense just to dovetail the two together with the third criterion. So that's what we're proposing to do for this. Okay, so the main strategies for helping homeowners and improving efficiency are to clarify and streamline code sections related to the Historic Preservation Code, and then add the Secretary of Interior standards for treatment of historic properties as review criteria, providing clear and more objective criteria. Right now, they're in the code as factors to consider, and that becomes a little bit more ambiguous when you're trying to apply them when someone is in for an exterior alteration of their home. And so it's much easier and more concrete to apply the Secretary of Interior standards for treatment of historic properties as actual criteria, as a lot of other jurisdictions do. They're nationally recognized criteria for treatment of historic properties, and they are just, they're not unreasonable, they're just common sense approaches for treating historic properties and doing restoration on historic properties. We also are clarifying those actions that are exempt with the Preservation Code. And then finally, we clarify the review criteria for designating historic properties, moving or demolition of a historic resource, exterior alterations, including window restoration. And then we also added a clearer and more objective, but not a clear and objective, definition of a minor alteration to provide more flexibility for property owners and contractors. So there's a little bit more of a degree of certainty when someone is applying for that kind of an application. Strategies for maintaining the integrity of historic landmarks. This will provide the Historic Resources Advisory Board with the authority to demolish and relocate National Register property, review and approve major alteration of landmarks unless combined with other development applications reviewed by the city manager or DRC. Currently, the major alteration of landmarks is going straight to the DRC. Usually they're bundled, sometimes they're not, and ATRAB felt that there would be a little bit better quality control and more historic integrity preserved if they were the review authority for major alterations that stand alone as their own application. Additional strategies for maintaining integrity of historic landmarks would also include to clarify the process for moving or demolition of a historic landmark, require the demolition of a resource to be part of a viable site development plan. So in other words, if somebody comes in for a demolition, they can't just decide to demolish the house and walk away from the property. They would have to tie that with an actual development plan and program to justify the removal of the historic resource. We would also want to provide for deconstruction or salvage of historic elements where practicable. And then add a new code section to address demolition by neglect. And we'll get into that a little bit further on in the preservation, further on in the discussion. Okay, so before we begin a more detailed discussion of the code revisions, I just want to briefly discuss where we've been with the public process so far. All of the required notification measures and opportunities for input as specified in the code were provided during this process, including noticing to all the neighborhood associations and business organizations. Planning staff also conducted 4 work sessions, I had mentioned earlier, with the Historic Resources Advisory Board on June 12th, 2019, July 10th, 2019, September 11th, 2019, and October 9th, 2019. And then we had 2 work sessions with the Planning Commission on March 11th, 2019 and October 14th, 2019. And then we noticed on February 4th, 2020 to individual owners of historic properties and residents, and then also interested parties as well. And for next steps, we are At the top tier, on February 24th, the PC public hearing. We expect to come back on March 9th for the findings and recommendation if we can. And then on May 5th, it would be a city council study session if we need one. June 2nd would be the first city council public hearing, and then July 7th would be the projected adoption of findings by the, final adoption of the ordinance by council. So I won't go over these have already been discussed, but this is the list of code sections that are proposed to be revised. So just very quickly, I just wanted to go over the SHPO Model Code and the Oregon Revised Statute 660-0230-200. The administrative rule that deals with the preservation issues related to Goal 5 was recently amended to address properties on the National Register of Historic Places, and it adds protections to properties on the National Register that were not found in local land use codes. The SHPO Model Code identifies new language to be incorporated in the local land use codes, and it also includes the language that's in the Oregon Revised Statute. The CDC already meets many of the requirements for complying with these rules, and then the model code was pretty much just used as a palette for adding the code language that you see before you this evening. The city is a designated certified local government, which means that the city must meet certain qualifications to remain certified and maintain the partnership with the state, and thereby qualify for matching grants and other benefits from the State Historic Preservation Office. So our first code section would be 1251.035 Historic Resources Advisory Board. And for CLG compliance, the SHPO Model Code states that it's mandatory for the members of the Landmarks Commission have an interest in historic preservation. It does not make it mandatory to have an architect as an ATRAB member. But the current code does require an architect, which makes it a little bit difficult to find or locate someone who is in the architectural profession to serve on the board. The question that is before you this evening is whether or not the code section should be modified to allow the architect position to be optional with other professions to be considered when recruiting for new Historic Resources Advisory Board members. And I'm assuming I could get a nodding of heads. Or we can, okay, all right. So the next code section is 50.01.003 Authority. The proposed amendments under the authority section clarify who the reviewing authority is for various applications. Staff reviews minor alterations of landmarks and some major alterations of landmarks. And of course, the Historic Resources Advisory Board desires to be the review authority for major alterations to historic landmarks that are not combined with other development reviewed by the Development Review Commission. And then 50.06.0093, the Cultural Resources Inventory. This basically adds a new section to the code that provides a standardized approach to conducting historic property surveys, which is necessary for CLG compliance.
Oh, Planner Espy, if we can interrupt, one of the commissioners does have a question. Commissioner Fisher?
On the policy issue of the previous slide. I'm sorry, on the policy issue of the previous slide. Can we go back one?
Yeah.
Does the Planning Commission have the authority to even consider that? I thought that's a city council decision as to what each commission or board does.
Yeah, I could probably answer that, Commissioner Fisher. So it is within the scope of the Community Development Code and the Planning Commission's role in advising the council on changes that the city might want to make to the review authority. And that's what this is about, is who should the review authority be for this type of land use decision, which is historic alteration. So that's really where the Planning Commission's role is in advising the council with respect to changes to the Community Development Code, and this is one such change.
Thank you.
So this section helps to maintain the integrity of the historic landmarks locally and regionally and outlines specific requirements to provide a standardized approach to conducting historic property surveys. It includes language from the SHPO Model Code and is required for CLG compliance. And then 5006-0095, designation and removal of designation. This section helps improve the efficiency in processing applications of historic designations by combining the environmental significance within the historical significance criteria, and then consolidating and clarifying generally review standards. It also adds language to the designation criteria to ensure that the findings of fact regarding historic architectural significance of the landmark is used, and then streamlines criteria for designation of the historic resources. So the policy issue here is somewhat detailed, and we are asking if the landmark designation criteria can be amended to, first of all, have the National Register of Property nomination to serve as alternative designation criteria, so that when a property is designated by the state as a National Register resource, they can apply to be on the local inventory without addressing any additional criteria. They'd still have to apply, but they wouldn't have to address the additional criteria because they've already been addressed. Or the criteria that they have for National Register designation would mirror the criteria that we have in our code. And then two, we're asking if the criteria requiring either 50 years or exceptional historic architectural significance remain, or should it just be the test of 50 years? So right now in our code, we have a bimodal test for historic significance. It can either be 50 years old or it can have some kind of other significance if it's not 50 years old that outweighs or outweighs the numeric age of the property. And then 5006-0095, designation and removal of designation, which is continued. The proposed code changes in this section also help improve the efficiency in processing applications of historic designations by removing the economic, social, environmental, and energy, or ESE criterion from the designation criteria, but having it remain with the criteria for removal of designation. So in other words, we didn't feel that they needed, anybody that wanted to designate their property was already agreeing to do this. And we didn't feel that they needed to go through that rigorous of a test to designate. But then if they wanted to have the property removed from the designation, they would have to actually determine whether or not it met the ESEE standard. And then, of course, the question is, should we remove the ESEE criteria for designating owner-consented or National Register nominated properties? Under 5006-0096, moving or demolition of landmark or contributing resource, the proposed code changes in this section help maintain the integrity of remaining historic landmarks and enhances our partnership with the State Historic Preservation Office by providing the opportunity of having this deconstruction and salvage of significant architectural elements. And we find that deconstruction and reuse of significant architectural elements and other Lake Oswego historic resources promotes the historic preservation purpose to promote the historic, educational, architectural, and cultural, economic, and general welfare of the public through the identification and preservation, restoration, and protection of those structures, sites, objects, and districts of historic and cultural interest within the city. And then, of course, the policy issue requiring deconstruction will add to construction costs during the city's review and adoption of, and they'll add to the construction costs. And then during the city's review and adoption of a voluntary deconstruction program back in 2019, staff found that deconstruction adds approximately $5,000 per lot where an existing single-family dwelling is removed to make way for new construction. So we're asking if conditions of approval for demolition should require deconstruction and salvage of significant architectural elements where practicable. So it would not be a mandate, but it would be something that would be encouraged at this point.
Madam Rusby, we do have two questions. Commissioner Fisher?
Is there a financial incentive to having a historical property designation of any sort other than social good? So like, is there a tax abatement or some kind of incentive for somebody to say, yes, I want my,
Tax freeze or a freeze in the assessed value of the property if it is a designated historic resource on the National Register. And then they can also qualify, both locally with the city of Lake Oswego, they can qualify for a historic preservation grant that up to $5,000 to do any kind of historic renovations. And then there's also the HPF grants and other grants available through the State Historic Preservation Office that one can apply for if they have a local landmark listing.
and is there a clawback? So if somebody got those benefits and then decided that, oh, I don't want it anymore, is there any way to say, well, okay, you got rewarded for having a historic designation? Is there some clawback that says, okay, you don't want it anymore?
I'm not super familiar with the rules of, or the enforcement rules for receiving grant funding, but I do believe that they do lose their grant money and, of course, their tax status if they decide to demolish their property that was once in a tax deferment status.
Vice Chair Pepe?
Regarding the policy issue that we're talking about right now, with the deconstruction or salvage, if it was salvage and ATRAB or another agency is going in there and removing items of historical significance, is that at the cost of the homeowner? Or is that at the cost of the agency going in there and removing the items?
It would normally be the cost of the homeowner to deconstruct and salvage the materials.
So what we found in our research on the voluntary deconstruction program when the city adopted the demolition tax was that when the industry was getting up and running, the fee or the cost to the homeowner was, obviously for the labor involved, but it also was set based on the fact that very little of the material or not as much of the material would be marketable, would be sold. There weren't as many outlets, maybe I should put it that way. There weren't as many places that were available to sell the materials retail or wholesale. Now there are more places, even in the Portland area, that are doing this. And some of the contractors who do deconstruction operate retail outlets themselves. So there's more of a return for the contractor who's going out and salvaging these materials and not having to use a middleman, so to speak. And the costs have come down, is what we learned from the person at the City of Portland who manages this program. At least the real costs, the fees may be going up, but the real costs have come down. So from that standpoint, there is a market for the materials. The homeowner still has to, there still is a cost for someone to come onto your property and do it. I don't think it pays for itself, and certainly the contractor isn't making a profit just by collecting the materials and then selling them.
Yeah. And then as a concrete local example, we have the Johnson Barn over in First Edition, whom we are working with the applicant to restore. And we happen to have a barn being demolished over in one of our city parks. So we're able to coordinate the transfer of materials that this gentleman might need to restore his barn with the barn that's being demolished.
Vice Chair Pepe, another question?
So when the items are removed, it's not HRAB or the City of Lake Oswego wanting to secure those for some future purpose here within the city. The homeowner is just being, if this were to pass, would be required to remove them and then sell them at will.
That's correct. Yeah, we would not, I mean, this is an unusual situation because it's a parks property and that sort of thing, so it worked out really well, but generally, ATRAB or the city would not be a purveyor of architectural salvage materials.
The existing program, again, it's a voluntary program, but it requires, in order to receive the discount on the demolition tax, the property owner has to contract with a certified deconstruction contractor. And so we're relying on the list that the city of Portland maintains. They have a training and certification program for that. And that way there is some assurance, or there's some quality control that the contractors are following certain rules around deconstruction on top of, the requirements that exist for demolition, which include, abatement of asbestos and hazardous materials.
So there could be an offset there by reducing the demolition cost by removing the salvage. Okay.
Thank you. Plan RSP, no further questions.
Okay, so 5006-0097, alteration of a landmark or contributing resource. The code changes in this section help homeowners comply with preservation requirements and improve efficiency in the processing of applications for historic remodels by clarifying and consolidating the review standards to minimize repetition, and then continuing to exempt all painting unless the paint color was noted in the statement of significance and a different color is being proposed. Adding maintenance of landscaping as exempt maintenance. However, significant changes would still be reviewed as a minor alteration if the landscaping is identified as a significant resource on the site. So if there's some aspect, some landscaping aspect that's on the site that's considered significant, then that would have to undergo a minor development. But in general, landscaping maintenance or changes to the landscaped environment of a historic property is exempt. Another one would be permitting unsubstantial changes in appearance and alterations for handicapped access. And then describing the methodology of window restoration and window replacement. And that just adds to the degree of certainty that someone might have in attempting any kind of treatments to the windows on their historic building. And then, of course, we would add, as previously mentioned, we'd add the Secretary of Interior standards for treatment of historic properties as review criteria instead of merely having them as factors to consider. And that's a nationally recognized standard that provides clearer criteria for historic treatments and rehabilitation. And then 50060098, this is about the land divisions, lot line adjustments, and other development in historic districts. Now, the city does not have a historic district now. There are just individually designated buildings, but there could be a historic district in the city one day, and we just wanted to make sure that we had a good set of code standards to address those if and when those things occurred. So these changes help the homeowners comply with preservation requirements and improve the efficiency in processing applications by clarifying that the association of the resource to the property is to the historic significance rather than merely just being on the site. And then it also removes the whenever possible provision, which is somewhat ambiguous, relating to the removal of landscaping noted in the statement of significance on a parcel upon which a landmark is located that is proposed for a land division or a lot line adjustment. Because if the land division or lot line adjustment would remove vegetation that's a necessary element of the historic nature of the landmark, so that its removal would diminish the historic nature of the landmark, the removal should not occur. But if it doesn't diminish the historic significance, then it can occur. So we just wanted to clarify that and make sure that there wasn't any landscaping on the property that would be considered historic before, as we go through the review of any kind of a lot division. We would allow, of course, the removal of landscaping when it conflicts with utilities or other requirements of 5006-009 or applicable city, state, or federal regulations, notwithstanding the statement of significance that includes the subject landscaping, and then clarifies the standards for new construction of non-contributing resource structures that are minor or major developments. So 50060098 continued. Further, under this requirement, we'd like the Planning Commission to consider if new construction and alteration of non-contributing resources be applicable only when new construction is a minor or major development or in a historic district, or the complementary requirement be expanded to alterations of existing structures in historic districts, or the complementary requirement be removed entirely for all non-contributing resources, whether new construction, alteration, minor or major development in historic districts. So in other words, is it even necessary to have any kind of review criteria for a contributing structure and this is a structure that could be designated but is not designated and in a historic district with other properties that are designated that make up the historic district. So the question is whether or not new development or other kinds of things would need as rigorous a review process or would need to have a minor development if they were in the historic district. The proposed code sections in Section 9 help comply with the recent amendments to the Oregon Administrative Rule and the SHPO Model Code and maintaining the integrity of historic landmarks by adding a specific definition of demolition applicable only to the National Register properties, and then providing for the review of a demolition or relocation of a National Register resource. And this is really where we apply the newly revised language from the Oregon Administrative Rule. And so the new provisions address National Register properties requiring that applications for demolition to comply with the rule, requiring local governments to protect National Register properties proposed for demolition or relocation through the consideration of factors. And so when they developed this and they did the rulemaking, they developed quite a few good rules, but they didn't quite get to specific criteria for demolition. Rather, they came up with factors to consider which are on this list. And so these are the factors identified under the Oregon Administrative Rule. And so as I stated earlier, the listed factors are not criterias under the rule. And we had quite a bit of discussion about this. The Deputy City Attorney raised the question with DLCD staff as to what the basis of any condition of approval beyond conditions to document the condition of the National Register resource or denial would actually be. And the DLCD staff provided further information about the interpretation of this section, and there was a lot of discussion as described in the staff report, but the bottom line was that if the factors listed in Section 8A are considered, opportunities for continued preservation for some or all of the historic value of the site discussed and a decision supported by the discussion is made, then the National Register site has actually been protected. So really it just means you just had to consider the criteria, that you didn't have to necessarily meet them, which is kind of esoteric in a way. But it's the take home on that is that it's not as rigorous as actual criteria. You just have to consider these factors. So the National Register site has been protected, and no matter what the local decision ends up being, this is the simpler test to consider the factors rather than meeting specific criteria. So we really just, in this subsection, we just carried the rule that the DLCD provided over into the code. We didn't change the factors into criteria or add any additional rigor to the review of National Register properties for the time being. Now, in order to remedy this, we have about 5 properties right now that are off on the National Register but are not on our local inventory of historic places. So they are not subject to our typical review criteria. So they would be subject to this rule, which is fairly, fairly loose. But in the future, I think what we would like to do as another step to this process, further down the road and with the property owner's permission, is to designate those 5 remaining properties that are on our National Register but not on our local land use inventory, so that they would be subject to our review criteria.
Planner SBO, one question. Commissioner
Yes.
Stewart?
What are those 5 properties?
There are, I don't have them off the top of my head, but
But are they residential or are
Yes,
they
they are
commercial?
residential
They're all like,
properties.
they're all single family?
they're all single-family
Okay,
residential properties.
that's all,
Correct.
thank you.
Okay, and then finally, we have a new section, it's the property maintenance section. And this new section helps maintain the integrity of historic landmarks by requiring the continued maintenance of historic properties. It's modeled after the Oregon City Code, Article 1525, demolition by neglect. And it requires a property owner to maintain their property so it doesn't deteriorate over time. If a historic structure deteriorates to the point where it's a dangerous building under the building code for the abatement of dangerous buildings, then like for any other building that has so structurally deteriorated, the obligation for repair would be addressed under that section and would be subject to compliance under the building code. But a demolition by neglect policy is different than the enforcement of unsafe buildings, and it would require owners to maintain their properties so that they don't deteriorate over time in the first place and become into that dangerous status. The city could be obligated, if this rule were a part of the code, the city could be obligated to inspect properties on receiving a complaint and then take enforcement action when there are signs that the building is deteriorating before the building becomes unsafe. The city would also be expected, though it is not obligated, to implement the preventive inspection program. And then, of course, the policy question here is whether or not the city should adopt a property maintenance requirement for historic landmark structures to prevent the neglect of a landmark. And although it isn't within the scope of the Planning Commission to evaluate the fiscal impact of new policies, the Commission and Council should know that the city currently does not have the staff resources to fully implement and enforce a landmark maintenance requirement under state law. And the city would not be able to fund such a program with the building permit fees. So we're in a little bit of an FTE problem with the addition of this particular part of the code. And I needed to bring that forward for your consideration as well when looking at this particular code section.
Planner SBO, another question. Vice Chair Pepe?
If all of this was approved at some point in the future, what would be the quantity? How many landmarks would we be talking about?
We have, right now, we have 73 landmark and approximately there are about 45 of them that are single-family historic buildings.
So how many more would then come on to the
None.
list if this were to pass?
The only properties that would come on the list are those property owners who freely participate and apply to become designated.
Are there any applications currently in the pipeline?
Currently, no.
Okay. And of those current properties right now, are there any issues with deterioration?
Well, we have one property that is on the National Register but is not on our land use, that is not on our local inventory, that is in an advanced state of deterioration over on South Shore.
This would only apply to landmarks, not National Register properties.
Correct. And that's the
So the answer
qualification
is
I was.
that would not apply
Yeah,
to that
thank you.
property, to National Register property.
Right.
No further questions. Oh,
Spoke to you.
Commissioner Fisher, sorry.
One, how much more are we talking about? Like, we don't have the ability right now, you're saying, so are we talking about adding another person? Are we talking about diverting you from other projects? What?
Commissioner Fisher, on the one item that Mr. Espy brought to your attention that has a staffing requirement that we wouldn't be able to fulfill right now, when we present this to the city council, I'm sure we'll be asked, how could we deliver this? So, the options are typically to, stop doing something that you're doing now and reassign someone, or to adjust the workload accordingly, or to bring on staff resources, or to bring on contractor, consultant support. So there are different strategies that the city could deploy depending on, one, whether or not the city council would want to devote resources to this, and secondly, first of all, whether or not the city adopts the policy, and second, how the city would want to resource it.
No further questions. You can continue, Planner Espy, there's no further questions.
Okay. Yeah, I think that pretty much concludes the presentation. I hope it was done in a way that the information could be digested well, and we are now open for any additional questions or discussions you'd like to have over the entire code's change effort here.
Commissioners, any questions, or I'd like to open it up for public comment. I know there's only one individual out there, but I'll take a short session here on questions before we open it up. Commissioner Whitman?
Just curious, has it really been a problem to get an architect to sign on to your board?
It's not an easy task to find a qualified or an architect to sign on. We have a few designers that have been on, and so the change in the code would allow for that kind of flexibility without having the fully qualified architect on the board.
And second question is, if somebody applies for historic designation and then just lets the property go over a period of time due to age or changed economic circumstances, is there any teeth in any way to say, look, you've got to take care of this in X amount of time or something like that, because it seems like it could be a mess if people just got the designation for the benefits and then ignored it thereafter.
Well, fortunately, most of the financial benefits that are related to the designation are also related to the continued upkeep and
So
and
they
maintenance
are.
of your building. So grants are really related to fixing and maintaining and painting and that sort of thing. So it's very rare that we have a situation where we do have a property being neglected, especially in the city of Lake Oswego, where we have somebody neglecting their house to the point where they want to have it demolished.
Okay, thanks.
Commissioner Stewart?
This is more of a clarification question because I think I may not have heard this correctly. Is one of the items on the table whether or not to give ATRAB the mandate to relocate in lieu of demolish a structure? Or did I hear that wrong?
Well, we do have in our code provisions to relocate buildings that are being applied for demolition permits. And there is a mechanism in there to try to find an alternative property in a certain amount of time and whatnot.
But does any review body currently have the authority to require relocation in lieu of demolition? If somebody applies to demolish a historic property, can, say, a Development Review Commission or an HRAB require them to relocate it instead?
There's a time period that allows for the alternative location, but I don't believe that there's any code language that requires the relocation.
Okay, that's all.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Sumler?
What's the process for determining that a structure is ultimately being demolished through neglect? Is it by the owner not applying for maintenance grants? I mean, is that being policed? Or is it just based on a citizen's comment or, someone who's on the board, driving by and witnessing that things are deteriorating?
It's the overall aesthetic look of the house and whether or not the property is being maintained or not maintained. It's not tied to any of the grants that are available or any participation of those kinds of programs. But it's just a general look of disrepair, peeling paint, broken windows, those kinds of things that are clear and obvious signs of neglect of the house to the point where it would become an unsafe building.
Sure, and I guess my second question would be that, if there's a potential hardship with the current owner, but they're not applying for grants, like, I think that would be a telltale sign that they're, potentially trying to neglect the house for demolition, what I'm saying in that sense.
Yeah, that's a good question, because in some of the demolition by neglect code language that I have studied, they did have a carrot and a stick approach where, somebody did find, a municipality did find a house in disrepair, and they offered financial incentives or grants to provide to the homeowner to get the property back into shape.
So there's enough grant money to go around annually for grants and things like that, or is it, spread so thin that every 5 years someone is applying and potentially being eligible?
Well, in this environment, grants money is fairly scarce, and you do have to apply for it and qualify. I know that locally, the city earmarks $10,000 a year for properties to apply for. They generally don't get all $10,000. That usually gets divided up between 4 or 5 properties per year. And then there's also, depending upon what kind of project you're embarking on, there are preservation grants available through the State Historic Preservation Office as well.
Thank you.
I would add, I guess, the first question is, do we have a property maintenance obligation? That's the question before you. We don't have it at this point, so we haven't faced that problem. If we were to adopt that provision, your question, I think, is, well, how would we enforce it? At this point, it would say that it's a violation of the code to have neglect of landmark, okay? So that would be subject to a violation penalty, a fine. You could also, if the city manager found that to be the case, then we would issue a citation for violation. They would argue about whether or not it has in fact met the structural defect deficiency standard in muni court, like any sort of civil violation. If the judge found it was a violation because they had neglected it to become a structural defect, then they would impose a fine. Another option is it's also a public nuisance, and if the city wanted to proceed, I suppose, it would take efforts to go on the property, repair the property to eliminate the structural deficiency, and then lien the property for the costs on that. Obviously, that is a very cumbersome process because you've got to get on the property. You only want to improve it to the extent necessary to remove it, and then you end up with a lien. So now, I think what Planner Espy has indicated is that the city would also has it not in the code, but through its grant means and others, try to assist the owner to avoid that situation. But to answer your question specifically, it's a fine and potential enforcement through a public nuisance violation.
Commissioner Stewart?
Does the Secretary of Interior standards exempt review of exterior painting? Do you know? The reason I ask is one of the items that you discussed was to continue to exempt exterior painting as a required review, I guess. And maybe I'm wrong. I thought that the Secretary of Interior standards require that to be reviewed. I'm just trying to make a comparison, is all.
I'd have to look into the standard, but I believe I don't know if they go into the actual mechanism of review, rather they do ensure that, that the paint is of the same character and value and color as the original. And.
Right,
and
right.
I-
So there's some sort of
and I think the
compatible or
specifies
appropriate
that.
statement, that if you repaint or paint a resource a different color, it has to be done in an appropriate manner, I guess.
Yeah, and we actually do have a review requirement for a paint that is different from the paint that is being, different from the original paint on the building.
It looks like there's a applicability of minor development is required. Minor development review is required when building paint color changes on a historic landmark. It says when the finding of fact regarding the historical, architectural, archaeological, or cultural significance of the landmark included building paint color. So if the building paint color was of significance
Right.
in the designation, then a change in that color can trigger a minor development application. So I think we've responded to that national, or that Secretary of Interior standard, but in a City of Lake Oswego code manner.
Commissioner Fisher?
I apologize if I'm going backwards. I want to pick up with Commissioner Seller had asked about the enforcement mechanisms. And the things you were talking, Attorney Boone was talking about issuing violations if there's neglect and things. How is that different than if, let's say, I let my house go into neglect? Is there a need, is there a special need here? Is it different than if it was aimed at me as just a homeowner? And if it is not different, then why do we need it here as opposed to the regular code?
I think, if I can, there is some overlap, I think, on the dangerous building. I mean, when you're looking at whether or not there's an adequate foundation, whether it's subject to being fallen down, that type of thing, a structural defect, that could be addressed, I think, also in the dangerous building. This, I think it obviously heightens the focus on historic properties. So I think there's, by calling it out for historic properties, it gives a greater incentive to staff and other members of the public to kind of keep an eye on it to make sure it doesn't get to that point. We've only had, I've only been here 20 years, and we've just had our second dangerous building. So in the general population, so we really don't, we respond by complaint and not many arise. I don't know how many historic buildings arise either. But when I look at the examples under subcriterion D, criteria for determining collective landmark, I guess I don't want to necessarily say that all those examples would qualify as a dangerous building, such as whether the fireplace or chimney is listing or bulging due to defective material or deterioration. I'm not sure that would necessarily qualify, because I think we're looking at the dangerous building, we're looking at whether the structural part of the building will fall, not necessarily the chimney, whether it's bulging or listing. But, so there's probably just a little bit more characteristics that could qualify as a neglected landmark than there is under dangerous building. But I think the point is, but yes, there are certainly anything that would qualify as a dangerous building would be listed here.
Thanks. Commissioners, any further questions? I would like to open it up for public comment. we do have an ATRAB board member representation. Green, would you like to give any feedback to the commission? Sure.
Suggestion to pause it. My name is Shar Green. I am the chair of the Historic Resources Advisory Board. I am also coincidentally the executive director for the Oswego Heritage Council, so I'm wearing both hats with this comment that I'm about to make, or this suggestion. I hope it's kosher to do this. The question regarding monitoring the condition of landmark homes or properties that have been on the landmark designation list to make sure that on an annual or even, a biannual basis that someone is going through and making sure that they are intact. If there are not the FTEs within the city council to do that, I'm pretty sure I'm speaking for not only the Oswego Heritage Council, but also the Lake Oswego Preservation Society, and that being something that I think both organizations would be interested in basically taking that as a contract so that we would manage it. We would do the surveying on like I said, an annual or a biannual basis, and then submit a report to the city, and that would save the city needing to either pull people away from other jobs or have to hire someone new. So again, I'm not sure if that, but that's the largest thing that struck me.
Thanks, Char.
Thank you. Commissioners, any comments for Chair Green? Thank you. Sorry, Commissioner Stewart.
Sorry, I must have rung in late. What is HRAB in general pretty supportive of what's being presented tonight? Or is there anything that they
Oh,
kind of?
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
If I could ask anything, it would be that you would all vote yes on everything. It's very important to every one of us who serves on this board and who is involved in any way, shape, or form with historic preservation in the city of Lake Oswego, that we continue to try and preserve that sense of place. Those of us who were not born here and grew up here, but moved here out of choice, moved here for a reason, and it was because the aesthetics of Lake Oswego pleased us, not just the school districts or anything else. And so it is very near and dear to our hearts to both preserve that history, but more importantly, in an architectural sense, to maintain that sense of place that we get from many of the beautiful historic structures that we have in our city. I would like to comment that I would just like to make a comment that I think that any demolition by neglect that we have seen, you generally don't see that with, for the most part, with private homes. People who own a historic home in Lake Oswego, it tends to be quite a beautiful home that's worth fair amount of money, and so people tend to take care of their properties. The only issues you run into are situations where maybe someone has purchased a property and has decided that they just don't want an old house. They want to tear it down and build a whole new one. And so that's a whole different kettle of fish. But for the most part, those of us who own or live in historic homes, myself included, we tend to cherish them and appreciate the history of them, and that's part of the mission of both the Lake Oswego Preservation Society and the Oswego Heritage Council to continue to keep the public aware of what a rich history that we have here in Lake Oswego and why it should be preserved.
Vice Chair Pepe.
Actually touched a little bit on the question I was going to have. Based on one of the requirements wanting to be lucid, having an architectural individual, professional on the committee, how many of those on HRAB or Historical Preservation Society actually reside in or own historical
Homes and, okay, so on HRAB, My house was built in 1924 by Wade Pipes for the first supervisor for Mount Hood National Forest. Rachel Verdick, the vice chair, she lives in a home that was built in 1940 by a gentleman named Ray Wason, who built quite a few structures around Lake Oswego in the 20s and 30s and 40s. Casey Holwerda, her house is on the lake. It's also a Wade Pipes circa 1926, I think, or 28.
These are all listed on their historical landmarks, whether it's Lake Oswego or National Registry.
Correct, most of them,
They're not
yeah.
total homes.
Most of them are, yeah. We have very few people on our board who don't live. In fact, one gentleman on our board lives in the house that he grew up in that was built in the early 1950s. So, yeah, we're all pretty involved in that.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Stewart?
The question of complementary, there was these three options that were presented relative to construction or remodel of non-contributing structures in historic districts. What is HRAB's position on that?
Again, from a common sense point of view, if you have a historic district where the predominant number of structures within that designated district are historic, and you do have some that are not considered non-contributing for whatever reason, I still think that it's, I would say, speaking for HRAB, that our feeling would be that anyone who lives in that neighborhood is still going to want some kind of common sense guidelines applied to the removal of a non-contributing resource and its replacement with something else. So that you don't end up with a 1922 Craftsman sitting next to a uber-modern Pacific Northwest three-story chalet, basically. If that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
And then to the other side of that, you don't want to have something that exactly mimics another
Yeah.
designated building. You want something that's in the time period, but not exactly what,
Yeah.
an exact replica of any other building within a district.
Commissioner Simler?
Are there neighborhoods within Lake Oswego that you consider to be the historic district or could potentially be historic districts in the future?
Yes, I do, but I know that there have been issues in the past. The general public tends to be in fear of those sorts of situations. They think that it means that they lose control over their house and that they're not going to be able to, do what they want with it and that sort of thing. A lot of people mistakenly believe that having a landmark or a National Register house means that you can't remodel the inside of it. That's not true at all. So I know that there were efforts in the past for like Old Town to become a designated neighborhood, and I think that they just couldn't get enough people to agree to it, which is therein lies the rub. Personally, I would have loved to have seen First Edition to have become a historical district. Now, I'm worried that it might be a little too late, to be honest. Every time you go through that neighborhood, there's another house gone and a new one going up.
Commissioner Fisher?
I'm always asking the question one late, so I apologize. There's that provision that says it cannot mimic. Is that a mandate? So if I want to build something that looks like a house that's there, I can't do it? Or is it that it's recommended that they try not to mimic, or?
The answer to the question is yes, you can build a house that has similar architectural styling as a house that is a designated building within a historic district, if you were, but what they don't want you to do is do something what's known as conjectural, or to build something that would be an exact replica of a house that no longer exists, or maybe a house that does exist and, it should be slightly different or should reflect the current time period and have enough elements for someone to know that, yes, they did incorporate the architectural elements of a historic structure, but that it's clear that the house was built in present time.
Commissioner Summer?
Just to kind of follow up on that, so I know that you were mentioning being opposed to potentially a contemporary home being built next to a historic home, or within a district or a historic neighborhood. Or if a contemporary home was built of refurbished material from historic homes, is that something that, the committee would be opposed to, or something? Is that like a no-go for development within these?
So, yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, and perhaps I didn't make my point very clear. I think what I was trying to convey is that HRAB and me personally and anyone who's passionate about this, it would be one thing if you had like a 1922 Craftsman and, maybe an empty lot next to it or that sort of thing. Then I think you should build whatever you want to build on it. What I wouldn't want to see, and what most of us wouldn't want to see, is a beautiful 1922 Craftsman next to another beautiful one that got torn down in order to build that uber modern Pacific Northwest treehouse. Does that make sense? Yeah. So none of us hate modern architecture or anything like that. We all have a great, if you love historic structures, then you also love good modern architecture, because good taste and good architecture is good no matter when it was built.
Definitely. I guess that leads into my next question is, as the stipulation of time goes on, 50-year, time period where all of a sudden you could be considered a historic building, what's your take on houses that may not necessarily have much significance being eligible for historic preservation?
Okay, let me see if I understand. Are you?
It's just a 50-year-old house, and by default, because it's 50 years old, it doesn't have an architect or a designer who has any recognition whatsoever, but is essentially eligible for, historic preservation. What's your take on that? Are you opposed? Are you, because it has 50 years under its belt?
Oh, yeah, no. I'm not a architectural Nazi. None of us are. And just because it's old doesn't mean it's good. And I think we all agree on that. So that's why I think we are all in agreement that it's very important that you have a code and you have a process and criteria in order to judge them, so that you're not just willy-nilly refusing to tear down anything older than 50 years. I mean, that makes no sense at all. Absolutely none. The house I grew up in Canada was built in 1927, and to be honest, it should have been torn down in 1929. So it's just, like I said, just because it's old doesn't mean it's good. And you still, it all comes down to common sense.
If I can just expand on that, the criteria on page 12 and 13 of designation, because I think the staff report or the presentation perhaps summarized it a little too much. It's either on the National Registry list, nomination, or the resource is 50 years or older and the resource has historical or architectural significance, or it's less than 50 years old, but it has exceptional historic or architectural significance. Either, any of those would qualify for designation. So merely being 50 years old is not enough.
No, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Vice Chair Pepe.
So maybe I missed something, but help me understand, if there's a house that's been dilapidated and it's in, well, it doesn't actually have to be dilapidated, but there's a house that somebody wants to bring down, and it does have maybe some significance to it, but it's not livable for them. Their family's larger or whatnot, and it wouldn't accommodate them. You would be opposed to them rebuilding the exact same structure?
So when you say not livable, you mean in the sense that?
They've got 10 kids and it's a
They've got 10,
three-bedroom home
right.
and they need to
Right.
redo it and reconfigure it, but it would be much the same character and aesthetics. You would be opposed to them?
No, then that would be a question of if it's a landmark, then they come in they make a decision on what they want to do, how they want to add in, and then they go through the application and the pre-app and all that sort of process with HRAB and then we would. The process for approving additions or remodels or major exterior changes to a historic landmark is not designed, we're not all sitting there wanting to say no to whatever somebody wants to do. Our mission is to assist the person by partnering with them early in the game in making sure that whatever they are wanting to do to that house is going to be an appropriate change or addition or however you want to put it. Does that make sense?
It's a good way of, yeah.
So in other words, the Historic Resources Advisory Board and the city support an adaptive reuse of historic buildings to
Okay.
meet the needs,
Oh, he's
to
much
meet,
more
to meet
eloquent
modern
than I
needs
am.
of modern families. And we have a long list of historic properties that have undergone renovations that have significantly increased their square footage to accommodate current needs.
Yeah.
So, absolutely, yeah.
And probably increase their value per square foot quite a bit, too.
Yeah.
Commissioners, any other questions for Chair Green?
Question.
Commissioner
Going back to the grants, and we're talking about renovations and things like that. Can grant money be used for a personal renovation? And is that something that someone needs to police?
For the local historic preservation grants, which I manage, they have to, first of all, they have to be designated on our local inventory. And it has to, the renovation that they're going to do has to be either a rehabilitation or a restoration or something that qualifies and follows our good old Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation and is done correctly and is architecturally compatible with the existing structure. So paint and rebuilding of windows and replacing siding, roof replacement, foundation replacement, those kinds of heavy maintenance items that people can't necessarily afford unless they get a little bit of help with the cost of materials and labor these days. It really helps out and people really benefit from it.
Yeah, a number of recent years, we've handed out grants to people who were having work to restore their original wood windows. Those are kind of examples of what people use that money for. So it's good.
Thank you, Chair Green. No further questions from the commissioners. Thank you for your testimony. We do not have anybody else present who would like to make testimony. So at this time, I'd like to close public testimony. Punter Usby, would we like to walk back through some of the questions you had for the commission on the individual items and then get feedback from the commission now? You'd like to start from like 50.01.001, the first kind of questions on your list, yeah.
So that's where 5001 starts, and then we can go to 5006. I'm not sure where you
I think
wanted
it's
to go.
going to go to the beginning.
To the beginning of your questions, policy questions that you want
Okay.
feedback from the commission on, yeah, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's the first one. So the question was whether or not the code should be modified to allow an architectural position to be optional with other professions to be considered.
Commissioners' comments? Commissioner Stewart?
Just my personal opinion, I don't think an architect should be necessarily required. I think there is enough variety of backgrounds in our community that have a good interest in issues of historic preservation to not require that.
Thank you. Any other comments? I guess I would agree with the comment that it shouldn't be required, but certainly if there could be language added to say that it's suggested or preferred, if possible, that an architect be there, but not required. Commissioner Fisher?
I guess my only concern is when you say other professions, I'm an attorney. Does that qualify me to be on that committee? Are you going to exclude things? Like, are there some people who shouldn't be on?
We can't think of any if there are. We do have someone who used to be an architect or an attorney on our board, and from a variety of different other types of professions, and they're all welcome if they have an interest in historic preservation.
If I can just add, on page 2 of the attachment 2, the proposed text is the member must have to have a knowledge, competence, or interest in historic preservation. In making the appointments, the city council shall take into consideration professional expertise in related fields of preservation, architecture, archaeology, community history, building trades, real estate, or related specialties. So it isn't just professionals, type of thing.
That's what I remember seeing it, but I.
Right. And to respond to your question about should we make it a preference? Well, remember, this is the city council making the appointment. And I don't know how I mean, if the code required the city council to have a preference for them, how's that enforced? I mean, that's my thing. So that's why it just says they should have an interest and take these into consideration and let the council decide.
So could we take out professions? I mean, if somebody, like, I don't know what Ms. Green's background is. Are you a professional of any sort?
I was a professional nurse for many years.
Is that,
I do run, along with my husband, we have a firm that specializes in historic restoration.
and so that's exactly the thing I'm talking about. Maybe the word professions is the problem. I mean, we have an expert here who has nothing to do with the profession.
And I think they're not necessarily mandating folks from
Yeah, that was my question.
These professions. It's just a suggestion. But I think, again, the key is this is the sort of thing that should attract folks that have just a working interest in the concepts of historic preservation.
Was the recommendation from the commission then that we make it optional and we recommend that we go with the wording that Deputy Attorney Boone had read from the model code, which described interest, but not anything like preferred or any other wording. It's actually the wording that Deputy Attorney Boone had provided. Commissioners, is there consensus on that?
Somebody?
Unanimous, yeah?
Do you want us to advance to the next policy?
Yes, please, yeah.
Okay.
Next question, should HRAB or the DRC have the reviewing authority for major alterations not combined with other development actions reviewed by the DRC? Commissioner Stewart?
I guess my question would be the alternative to that. So when there are applications that are combined with other development actions, what is the role of HRAB currently? Do they have like a
They have an advisory
recommendation
role.
voice or?
Right, so they, at the first entry point, they attend the pre-app and provide any comments that they have for the development applications that's related to the historic property or structure. And then when the land use application comes in, they have a second opportunity to provide additional comments on the application itself.
I guess,
Commissioner Stewart, it's a really good question because currently the model that Mr. Espy described is really an extension of staff. and it's a good relationship, and it's really extending our capabilities and bringing in the community knowledge. Shifting ATRAB to a decision-making role, at least on the major alterations where there isn't any other land use decision where the DRC would get involved, is a different mode, right? It's not, it wouldn't be appropriate for the decision makers to be sitting in on the pre-app.
Right.
Or to be providing that type of consultation. So it is a shift in roles and responsibilities. So I just wanted you to be aware of that when you make your
No,
decision.
that's a good point. I guess my concern here, though, and where I'm kind of leading with to from this question is in situations where there is an alteration or some sort of development proposed along with other development actions, it seems to me that there's more questions of compatibility and sort of HRAB type things that might need to be considered, right, in a situation like that versus one where it's just purely an adaptive reuse or a preservation effort.
Could you elaborate? Could you perhaps give an example of the type of the other?
Well, if, I
development?
guess, yeah, I'll try. If, so I guess if, for example, a property owner or a developer comes in and there's a large piece of land, and there's an old, say there's an old historic farmstead on it, and the application is to develop all the property, and maybe they break it up into a bunch of lots, but the effort is to retain the farmhouse. So there's questions of compatibility, is what, if what's developing around it appropriate? So that appropriate as far as an aesthetic, from an aesthetic point of view.
Yeah, it might be a question of applicability, and so the applicable development standards for the subdivision, let's say it's a subdivision, are going to relate to infrastructure, to the layout of the lots. If there are trees, certainly trees would be part of the review. Lot dimensions, density, that sort of thing. Unless there's an alteration to the historic landmark, you know, that landmark wouldn't really be in play. It really, I think it goes back to what is the nature of the landmark significance? Is it just the structure? Is it the grounds? Is it the relationship to, abutting developments?
Yeah, that may not have been the best example,
It's a
but I
difficult
was kind of
one.
on the fly.
Yeah. No, I see what you said. It's actually raised a question in my mind, because I'm not sure what do we look at when we have a land division. The parent parcel contains an historic landmark, but the landmark itself is just the structure.
And I guess I'm not suggesting that a different review body govern that. I guess, would a group like HRAB have the opportunity to, to formally present a position on that sort of, development?
As an example, the Carmen Farm is in for a small subdivision, and ATRAB did have say in that particular land use application in terms of the disposition of the farmhouse that's existing on the site, and then possibly, adding some architectural compatibility to some of the homes around it. That's still a part of the discussion, but we're still working that out.
And to be clear, that's a recommendation, not
Advisory.
Exactly.
advisory recommendation, not a decisional
Yeah.
part. When you're doing a lot line division, it's gonna be handled by the DRC, which reviews subdivisions. So it's not bundled. This question here is limited strictly to major alterations of the historic structure,
structures, yeah.
and it's not coupled with anything else, really.
Well, I guess I'm keying in on the last part there, major alterations not combined with other development actions. So the other side of that is, what about major alterations that are combined with other development actions?
Yes.
The DRC would review that with recommendations from HRAB.
Vice Chair Pepe?
I've been going back and through these papers. Somewhere in here, I believe there's a policy issue where it speaks to, or something that we touched on earlier, and it correlates a major alteration. It can be approved as long as there's a viable development plan.
Correct.
So if there is a major alteration, wouldn't that require a viable development plan?
That would only
And if
apply
that's
to,
the-
that would only apply to demolitions. So if somebody comes in for a demolition application of a historic building,
That's just for demolitions?
correct. So we wouldn't want somebody
Okay.
just erasing a historic building for no reason. If they have a legitimate project that they want to move forward and they need to demolish the building to do that and they address their appropriate criteria and get approval, then that's fine. They can go forth with their application.
And so
But-
this is speaking just
Right,
to remodels?
correct.
Planner SB, one question is, would this change at all the public process for how reviews are conducted? Would we be limited in any way providing public input and public testimony? My concern would be, would the Historic Resource Advisory Board just have a process where they would make decisions with maybe not as much public input or no public input like what would be done through the DRC process?
The change would be the reviewing authority only, and it would run through the same minor development review process that's outlined in the code that the DRC follows.
Okay.
Same noticing,
Same noticing.
all
same
that sort of thing.
everything.
But I think as Mr. Siegel indicated, the real shift here, I think, is, and as you heard the chair said, you know, that the HRAB takes a partnering relationship with properties that want to develop, but if they are also the decision-making body as to whether or not they've met that you can't partner with the applicant and be the decision maker. So, you know,
But there are other organizations in the community, like Preservation Society and the Heritage Council, that can provide that, I would assume can provide that kind of assistance outside of the regulatory world.
yes, but the effect, as you indicated, I mean, it would change the
Yeah, the
the
relationship.
role of the HRAB for that.
Yeah, the partnering would not occur with major alterations, but with only those that have HRAB's input.
Commissioners, any other comments, or is there a recommendation then to, yeah, Commissioner Fisher?
Does HRAB want the reviewing authority?
They specifically requested to have that part of the code changed because of their concern about maintaining historic integrity of structures that are undergoing major alterations.
Is the recommendation of the commission then to allow HRAB to have the reviewing authority for major alterations? Commissioners? Vice Chair Pepe?
I would say no.
No? Commissioners? Commissioner Whitman? Commissioner Smelmore? I would say yes.
Ordinarily, I'd say no, but HRAB is the one who proposed it, and so go with their recommendation.
Commissioner Stewart? Yes. I think that was 4 yeses and 2 nos. Want to advance, Paul, the next question?
Move on to the next one, please.
Next question, shall the landmark designation criteria be amended to have National Register property nomination serve as an alternative to designation criteria? And should the criteria requiring either 50 years or exceptional historic or architectural significance remain, or should it just be a test of 50 years? Commissioners?
Again, I just want, I think to clarify, it has to be 50 years and some historical or archaeological significance. Okay. It isn't just 50 years.
Yes, thank
So
you for
really, the
that.
question is, should the National Register property be an alternative to that?
Thank you, Deputy Attorney Boone. Commissioner Fisher?
I would, When you nominate somebody, a property to be on the National Register, that doesn't mean it's going to be accepted, right? So why would that be an acceptable alternative to the criteria? I could see if they said a National Register property being accepted.
Is that what we're intending, that it must be, it's either a National Register
It's
property
assumed,
already?
yeah, it's assumed that the property is on the National Register. They use the nomination as a assumed designation.
Commissioner Stewart?
I've got two questions. On part two there, can there be a situation where a structure or property is exceptionally historic or architecturally significant and be less than 50 years old?
The code allows for that now, and so I think that there was an
So
assumption
through
in the
the same,
past that
so through
that
the
was a
same petition
possibility.
process, you
Yeah.
can, okay. And then a comment on the first item. I'm not sure if this is the question that's asking or not, but it seems like if you apply for your property to be on the National Register through the review process, the State Historic Preservation Office would evaluate the local significance as well, right? So assuming that's been done and you receive National Register designation, shouldn't you automatically get local landmark status because that process technically has already been done?
Correct, and it is almost automatic, but not quite. We can't automatically bring it into our landmark inventory. It would still have to be applied for and follow the owner consent laws.
While it might seem weird, okay, property owners ask for National Register property designation. That's one process through the state, and so they go through that analysis and decide whether to designate it or not. Our local landmark Goal 5 process is different, okay? And there is a state statute which requires owner consent to be subjecting your property to the local Goal 5 regulations.
So
that's
why wouldn't an owner want both?
Well,
I mean,
they
if they,
certainly have the
let
Yeah.
me say it this way. If an owner wants National Register nomination, why wouldn't they want local recognition? I mean,
I guess I can't, I don't know, I can't speak for
That's
all
it,
owners. But there are some, obviously, that are not.
Apparently
And
there's
apparently,
five.
there's not a condition for National Registry acceptance to be on the local landmark list either.
Right.
So there is this
Right.
dichotomy.
Right, I understand that, maybe that doesn't exist, but it almost seems like to do both almost seems redundant in a way, because when you go through the National Register process, the vetting seems to already have been done, right?
Correct, and I think the motivation to be on the National Register in the past was to be on the special assessment tax rolls and have their property taxes frozen. And then, so once they go through that, they assume that they're done and they've gotten what it was they were after in the first place, which was the tax freeze. And so there really isn't a lot of incentive to move forward with the city process to be subject to additional design review requirements or regulation to be a part of the local landmark process, is my
Other than to apply for local
is
grants?
my guess, yeah,
Yeah.
other than to apply for local grants, right?
And the recognition and goodwill that comes from being on a local landmarks
Yes,
list.
absolutely. It's what makes this city the way it is today.
Vice Chair Pepe?
You made a distinction when you were giving your response of owner consent for the local list.
Correct.
Is the owner's consent also required for the national
Yes.
as well?
Oh, yes.
Commissioners, any further questions, or do we have a recommendation? Commissioner Sumler?
Is there any advantage to the city to bring these buildings onto the local landmark status? I mean, is there additional grant money that the city is able to apply for, or things like that? What's advantageous to the city?
Well, I think the most important thing is that it brings a degree of certainty as to what the houses or what the buildings are subjected to in terms of design review criteria and the requirements for when they do move forward with a demolition or a exterior alteration. They know what process they need to go through, what's under the regulation, what's not under the regulation. Right now, these 5 properties that are on the National Register but not on our local inventory and not subject to our review requirements are in somewhat of a no man's land in terms of regulation. They're only subject to the current policies under the revised Goal 5 rules that were discussed this evening.
Is there some benefit to the city? Again, we're carrying out the state's Goal 5 program. Right? We list certain types of tree groves and stream corridors. We protect them because it's a Goal 5 resource for the city. Same thing with historic resources, except there's this strange carve-out. If the owner doesn't consent to it, then we can't protect it. But our benefit is to fulfill the historic preservations of communities under Goal 5.
Right, and the regulatory programs is a requirement for the city to be able to, for the city to be able to receive state grants and then in turn to offer those grants to homeowners, to property owners. So that's the community development side of it is we have a regulatory program so that we can assist residents in this way. And there's the intangible quality or benefit of having historic resources that are protected in this way, and that I think the chair spoke to that earlier.
Just so you're checking a box for the state, essentially, right?
That's one aspect of it.
Yeah, okay, just making.
Vice Chair Pepe?
What's the biggest downside for those 5 properties to being on the Lake Oswego historical list?
Well, I think the biggest downside, I suppose, from the point of view of the property owner is being subject to the regulatory framework that is related to our design review requirements for exterior alterations.
The additional scrutiny?
Right.
Basically. So then the upside is potentially getting $1,000 to $2,000 every 5, 6, 7 years in a grant for.
Every year, actually, potentially. We give.
Right, but how likely is it that the same homeowner is
We give these-
getting more than a couple $100 every year in grants to improve their historical landmark? I would guess it's probably not
We've
very
had,
high.
if there hasn't been anybody else, we've awarded grants to the same homeowner.
Right, but how likely is it, right? With all of those on the list, how likely is it that a repeat homeowner is getting multiple hundreds or thousands of dollars every year consistently to do improvements on their landmark
We don't
home?
want it to become part of the maintenance program for a
Right.
homeowner, but.
So then the upside would be
but
maybe
it's possible that you'll
a couple
see-
thousand every couple years.
Yeah, I mean, you might see some serial improvements that a significant property is undergoing as part of a larger effort to, rehabilitate the home. There are other properties too that are not residences, like the Hunt Club is an historic landmark, and the city's awarded grants to that organization to do some very significant repairs and to replace windows. And so it's, I just wanted to make sure you're aware that it's not just residences.
Sure, yeah, no, I believe, I was under the assumption, I didn't realize the Hunt Club, I was under the assumption that those that were on the list right now were just resident.
No, there's other historic resources that are on the list that are not.
And there's city properties.
Residences.
The city, when I was on ADJOURNMENT years ago, the iron furnace was, the city was going through a planning process to
Okay.
restore the furnace. And was successful, I believe, in receiving grants from the National Park Service from the federal government. So, it's another way that I think the program, and again, the regulatory part is just one aspect of it, but having the program adds value to the community.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions? can maybe take these one at a time. So the first one, shall the landmark designation criteria be amended to have National Registry property nomination serve as an alternative to the designation criteria? Commissioners for this? Commissioner Whitman? Yes. Similar? Yes, I would be for it. Vice Chair Pepe?
It would still require the owner's consent, correct?
That is correct.
Yes.
No.
Commissioner Stewart? 5-1, the recommendation is yes on part one. The second part, I guess we want feedback from the commission on too, to keep the criteria requiring the 50 years and the exceptional historic and architectural significance, to allow that to remain. Commissioner Whitman? Yes? Similar?
Yep.
Yes, yes. Commissioner Fisher?
Well, I'm trying, should the criteria remain, I would say yes.
Commissioner Stewart? Yes. Unanimous for keeping
So that
that?
means we would stick with the 50-year requirement that we have, not default to the model code, which is allowing something less than 50 years if it's exceptional. Is that your straw poll?
Well, yeah, to be
That's
clear.
not how I'm reading that, is it?
Well, that's my question.
No, I think the code has both right now. They have 50 years and exceptional architectural significance. Or. It can either be exceptionally significant or 50 years old. That's the way the
Okay.
in there, I
All right.
believe.
And what is the commission wanting to do with that? That's the part I'm
Yeah.
unclear on.
Well, in my opinion, the exceptional historic and architectural significance is more important than 50 years, so we gotta have that for sure.
Yeah, you
I
got
agree, yes.
Whether it's 50
Got
years
two
or
on
not
number
is
two, yeah.
not relevant to me.
We have right now in the text, it has, and the question is, what do we keep? 50 years plus historical and architectural significance, or less than 50 years plus exceptional
Okay.
historic and architectural
Thank you.
significance.
Yeah.
So the question is, do we keep both of those so you can have less than 50 years if it has exceptional type of thing? Or do you just say 50 years? Okay.
Right.
Oh, I think
The
that's what
first
we all
one.
thought we were voting on.
I think that's
Both, right?
said.
I mean, I
Well,
think,
it's an either or, right? So it'd be
Well,
the first
yeah.
one.
yeah, again, the code amendment is National Registry, 50 years or older plus historic or architectural significance, or less than 50 years plus exceptional. Okay. Now, that seems to me to cover everything, okay? Requiring some historical significance.
Who's on first?
I just lost it, hold it. Are we voting to change, the existing one right now is 50 years or architectural significance?
It's either, so there are three paths, right? One is National Register qualified. Second is at least 50 years and architectural significance. And the third is, could be less than 50 years, but must have exceptional architectural significance. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, three paths. Is that existing, or that's what?
Well,
proposed?
I think Paul is right, is that existing is 50 years or older, you're good. Or there's historical or architectural significance.
Right.
Okay, so
We're
That's what the
proposing to
code reads today.
replace that.
replace that to require some historical or architectural significance. You know. And frankly, it ties in, if I can advocate for a bit, since if you look at an alteration or demolition or whatever, you look at an alteration, you look at the findings of fact that of what sort of historical or architectural significance it had to know what you can do with it, okay? So if you just say 50 years is good, you don't have any analysis then on what alteration is permissible
Right.
without
Should have
those kind of
some
findings.
Significance findings
So
with that.
I think it kind of goes hand in glove.
So would it be acceptable then if the commission considers changing it so it's not just 50 years, but 50 years and architectural significance? Commission, so can we get feedback on that?
50 years or?
No, I'm saying that
It
we
would need
would,
to be 50 years old with
And plus.
significant, with
yeah,
significant.
and we're recommending a change that would remove just 50 years by itself.
Yeah. So we're adding on significant,
Commissioner Whitman, yes. Commissioner Simler? Yes, I'd be for it. Vice Chair Pepe, yeah. Commissioner Fisher, Commissioner Stewart?
Well, I think that's helpful direction. The second part of the question, or the second question, which isn't really phrased correctly up there, is if the commission would want to have an option where a landmark that is less than 50 years could be designated, and the proposal is only where the architectural significance is exceptional.
Right.
Not just significant, but exceptional. And that, I don't know if that's dancing on the head of a needle or not, but
Let's
you know,
ask
50 years
questions.
is that's traditionally the threshold that
Yeah.
we've used.
So let's, go ahead.
And if I could just, and let's not lose sight of the fact, okay, that the owner really has to apply for this, you know? So whether, if an owner has property that is less than 50 years old but thinks has exceptional, right, and HRAB agrees, you know, fine, you know. I don't really think we're gonna reject property that an owner submits and it has historical significance, but we're gonna say, but it's not exceptional.
And you know what, if it's not 50 years old today, it probably
Well,
will be
yeah,
soon.
By the time we get there, right.
is there, point of clarification, is, for the national, does it have to be 50 years old, or do they also allow younger?
I believe they allow for exceptional significance in some cases, yes.
Okay, so by approving the previous one, where by owner's consent, if it's accepted into the national, they can use that criteria to get into, like, Oswego's list, I think by default, then we would need to approve.
Yeah, well, we would just want to have the criteria for designation on the National Register and our code criteria reciprocal, so that the application process that they would have to go through in order to be designated on our list would be much more simplified.
Right, so if a 40-year-old property was accepted in the national,
Yeah.
and by what we just suggested and moved forward with, we now have to approve something being younger than 50 years,
Right.
but exceptional or
Right.
wonderful.
Right.
We have to do that.
Right, we wouldn't go.
Or else
through
we're gonna
that
have a conflict
analysis.
again.
We wouldn't go through that analysis because it's on the National Register list. I mean,
Yeah.
if it was less than 50 and accepted.
Yeah, 'cause it's all
done.
been
But
done.
if they didn't go for National Register, but they wanted to be on the local landmark list, we still have the opportunity, the avenue, that they could be on the local landmark list.
What else would you like us then to take a poll then of, if it's less than 50 and has exceptional significance, whether that would be designated?
Yes.
Yes. Commissioner Whitman? Yes. Commissioner Simler?
Sorry, I have one last question. Is there the potential to put in a clause where there's a minimum number of years required before applying for exceptional architectural status? I'm just wondering, you know, a 2-year-old house and you know, homeowner could apply. Obviously, it could be turned down, but I don't know. I mean, obviously, there would have to be
Isn't the architectural
analysis based on
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's two criteria that you have to look at. You have to look at architectural significance and historic
Historical,
significance.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so it would be pretty hard. I mean, you'd have to be pretty close to the 50 years old, even with a modern mid-century home that, you know, may or may not be 50 years old to pass those tests. And so I think that the chances of having a situation like that would be pretty low.
Commissioner Simler then, or are you for it? Yes, I would be for it.
Yes.
Commissioner Fisher?
Ready?
So unanimous, yes. So next, shall the ESEE criteria be removed for designating owner consented or NR nominated properties? Planner SB, do you want to kind of refresh us on this question again to the commission?
So
Yeah.
the ESEE analysis is a part of the Goal 5 rubric, and it is basically an economic, social, environment, and energy analysis that you do in order to create a balancing between whether or not it's a benefit to have the house, you know, standing versus not having the house or having the house demolished or undesignated. So we felt that it didn't really make any sense to have ESEE criteria for a property owner's because it'd be a lot more, because there are people that actually do want to designate their buildings, and they do, they become shy about doing that because there's really there's too much procedure involved with having to do it. There's too many criteria to meet, and so they give up on doing it, and we lose potential designated buildings. So we want to try to make it a little bit easier for people to designate their buildings by removing this, at least this requirement, along with other points of clarification in the code, so that when they do voluntarily come in and apply, they don't have to go through this rigorous process to designate. We are leaving it, of course, in a situation where they want to remove the designation for purposes of demolishing the house or no longer being historically, or being on the historic register.
And just by way of background, and amending the code, because this code does implement Goal 5, we have to make findings, the commission makes findings that the code changes are in compliance with Goal 5, that we meet those policy objectives. So we believe that if the code is consistent with the state goal, that the review of applications under the code would also comply with Goal 5.
Commissioner Summer? Okay. Vice Chair Pepe?
So in here, I think you just clarified it, but maybe if I can get you to clarify it again, regarding removal.
Right.
How does this impact, it says here added to the criteria for removal, but I think you said this language remains.
It remains in I believe it is already in the criteria for removal.
Can we get, is there any way to confirm that?
Well, there is a list of things by which you should do in the code to designate. And then the removal of a designation is just the reverse of that process, which includes the ESE analysis.
So what we're trying to do is lower the bar for approval,
For designating.
but have the bar higher for removal.
To having the bar remain the same for removal.
No,
As we currently have.
because if we're lowering the bar for approval and the bar is remaining the same, that means we're also lowering it for removal. But we're keeping the bar higher for removal.
Right.
Yes.
I think he means keeping the criteria the same. Not,
Well, if I can again, the current criteria is the same criteria for designation and for removal.
Right.
Which includes the ESEE. Proposal is to decouple, remove the ESEE on the theory that if a property owner is willing and it has historical or architectural significance, then that's good for the community. Tips the balance on the community side. We don't need to make that finding every time. But for removing the property on it, the property owner would have to show that there is some benefit to the community of demolishing the thing, okay? That is, it's dilapidated or deteriorated or something like that, or repurposed or whatever. But yes, it does have an additional step then, it raises the bar to remove the property from demolition. It keeps it the same, if you will, because currently there's an ESE analysis required for removal. But we're removing that requirement for designation, so it does add a bar.
Right.
To it.
And if you think about it, the ESE criteria, if you say we were using benefits to the community, designating the landmark as shorthand, designating the landmark has environmental, social, economic, and energy benefits, retaining a landmark versus demolishing and building anew. So it's really just jumping to that conclusion that ESEE is meant for all designations that, otherwise meet the criteria. So that's maybe more theory than it needs, but that's why we're able to get there, I think, with Goal 5.
Commissioner Fisher?
Does it impact, Director Siegel, does it impact your job to do this or not do this?
It impacts staff workload. More importantly, what I think it'll do, and what ATRAB is hoping that it'll accomplish, is remove barriers to designation, and more people will participate in the landmark program because they're not having to, hire a consultant or do this paperwork that we would currently require. It does reduce the staff time that's involved in reviewing these applications. I don't know, do we charge a fee for landmark designation?
No, we do not.
So we don't have a fee. I think it makes the process more streamlined.
Commissioners, you want to give feedback? So the recommendation of the commission to allow the ESEE criteria to be removed for designation? Commissioner Whitman? Commissioner Simler?
Yes.
Yes, I would be for it, yes. Pape, no?
No.
Commissioner Fisher? Commissioner Stewart? So 4 yeses and 2 nos. So next is the deconstruction, or demolition, excuse me. The policy issue is requiring deconstruction will add to construction cost. Shall deconstruction be required in conditions of approval for demolition request? Commissioners' comments? Vice Chair Pepe?
Is this exterior only?
Well, the deconstruction would be related to the demolition of the entire building, and most people salvage windows and siding and things like that, and it would be mostly exterior. But we haven't stipulated that in the code. It was just an overall.
I think, are you asking what are the trip wires, or what are the criteria for?
No, I'm getting back to it. It was mentioned earlier that anybody can, if you're on the national or the Lake Oswego list, you can remodel the heck out of the interior and there's no problems whatsoever.
Right.
So if you're gonna do that, then anything of significance, whether it's a ornate fireplace mantle or something else of significant importance, you can rip that out and there's no issue.
Yeah, it's a good question.
So we're talking here then,
Yeah,
exterior only.
yeah. Well,
How far into the interior does the exterior extend?
yeah, and I think that we were looking at it under the heading related to complete demolition of the building, requiring deconstruction at that point of any salvageable materials. We didn't really look at remodeling on the interior.
The language, I'm just going to read it because it's, I think, helpful. It says require deconstruction and salvage of significant architectural elements. And so it's not requiring any salvage of interior elements. I mean, that, really the significance of the structure is usually tied to the exterior. So there's-
Right, but I'm hearing a lot of usually and mostly. So what I'm trying to get an idea of, is this specific to exterior? And if it's not, and it mostly or it usually is, then how far into the interior does the exterior extend?
It's not specific to exterior. It just states salvaging of significant architectural elements. So we would look at, I think we would look at the statement of significance, the profile for the property, and see, why was it designated? What are the significant elements? To what extent is it practicable to salvage elements, whether they're interior or exterior? I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Paul.
The only thing that I can say is that it, adds to the sustainability program with our city where we deconstruct materials from the house.
I guess, and I would just add, these are conditions of approval, so they can be tailored to the demolition application. When the HRAB is looking at what property is to be demolished and they're looking at statement of significance, they could tailor in their condition of approval, it's the windows, it's the stairway, it's the this, it's that.
Right, now, I'm looking at it from the lens of a new owner of the property who did not go through the process of making it a designated landmark, whether national or city. And they're wanting to do something, upgrades of whatever, or even tear it down. There's gotta be some way for them to understand what they're gonna be held accountable for. It seems like it's pretty abstract right now, at least for me.
So if this requirement is adopted, I think we would want to integrate it or build onto the existing deconstruction program or voluntary program that we have. And in that program, a certified deconstruction contractor is hired by the property owner. They choose, who they use. And that contractor is really going to be in a position of determining what's salvageable or not. And based on the demolition permit and the conditions of approval, if it's clear that the statement of significance is limited to the exterior, maybe it's an excellent example of particular architectural style where really only the double-hung windows are significant. I'm just making this up. So then I think it would be clear what the scope of work is for the deconstruction contractor. You are asked to salvage the windows to the extent that they're, that they have any value and can be reused. I understand your concern if it's more ambiguous than that and it's not, the profile doesn't really tell us, or it's maybe it's interior, then, we would be looking to ADJOURNMENT to help advise us on, based on the statement of significance and the information that we have about the structure, what is significant, what's potentially salvageable, and the deconstruction contractor would carry that out. So I think, from the property owner's perspective, anything you can salvage and get some money for is probably a good thing. So
It's the
there's an
cost
incentive.
benefit. What's the cost to remove it, and what can you actually get for it,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's a wonderful recycling program.
Exactly. If the cost of removing it and putting it into the market is more than what the return would be, then it's not salvageable. It's going to be recycled.
Yes, practicable is a defined term under the code, and it does take a look at cost and difficulty of completing the project. If I could load up, I'll read it to you, but, okay.
I trust you.
Okay.
Commissioner Stewart?
I almost wonder if we support this idea, if the way it's written into the code is almost abstract, or at least to the point where it says something to the effect that the review body may consider requirement of salvaging certain elements through conditions of approval. You see what I'm getting at? The policy issue that says requiring deconstruction says something very different. I guess it would need to be, the language have to be softened somewhat. So that it's understood that requiring deconstruction would happen on, the degree of deconstruction would be on a case-by-case
Right.
basis, right?
Does it not allow that?
Well, right now, a condition of approval of development, ADJOURNMENT shall require deconstruction if practicable. So your comment is basically move the shall, so that becomes.
Yeah, the
one,
shall
two.
is maybe harsh, I
Right,
guess.
and so it'd be ADJOURNMENT may require deconstruction, then the question, then they would have to apply, determine.
Right, yeah, I mean, I support that it should be encouraged. I guess the shall just, is,
You think shall encourage deconstruction? Or may require deconstruction?
I think the code should encourage it.
Should
The language should encourage it. I don't know what the right words are, but.
Well, right now, it gives ADJOURNMENT the discretion to determine where it's practicable. They may require it, or they will require it. On the other hand, if it started out by saying that it shall encourage, then it's, what does that mean? And if, the property owner objects, but there really are some significant architectural elements that, could be salvaged.
Well, then that's where the conditions of approval come in, that you won't approve something unless you do this, this, and this.
Encouraged.
Through the,
I'm hearing that part to say may require
May require,
deconstruction.
yeah.
So if ADJOURNMENT.
right, because it's discretion, it's a discretionary review,
Discretion.
right.
to decide whether to require it or not.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, because I mean, just from the standpoint, I think, you know, the cost of this is, I think on average is a little higher than you might think.
Commissioner or Vice Chair Pepe?
The current program with non-landmark homes it's encouraged, it's voluntary, right?
Right. Well, it's encouraged with the financial incentive.
And that financial incentive is,
The financial incentive is that if you're looking at a demolition and you do deconstruction, then you're receiving a $5,000 reduction on the fee for that.
and
on
so,
tax.
and so would that also apply to landmark as
It
well?
would. Yes, it would.
So you would have some cost offset.
Yes.
Sure. Any other comments or questions? Are we ready to make a recommendation then? Commissioner Fisher?
But I'm really concerned if you make it that they may require it, are we opening ourselves up to dispute? So why did you allow him and not me? So while I agree, shall seems harsh, but the alternative could be harsh too. So wow.
I think there's some reasonableness that's added just by the term practicable. And so Attorney Boone defined that there is a legal definition for practicable.
Well,
And I think that balances some of the
They
concerns.
may require it where practicable. So they'd have to get over the where practicable hurdle, first of all. Then your point is, well, they require it in one case where it's practicable, that they didn't require it in another case where it was practicable. Yes, but that is the very nature of discretion-based criteria. Presumably, and like when we have variances and that sort of thing, I mean, each case is different. We try to glean principles out of them, you know. The hearing body has to decide and weigh, you know, the past practices and apply it to this case. And they articulate a basis for doing so. And if there's a, you know, rational basis, you know, for doing so, then fine.
Here's the definition.
Oh, and thank you. Practicable, capable of being done after considering and balancing cost, existing technology and logistics in light of overall project purposes. That's
Commissioners, the recommendation? Question is, do we wish to modify the wording? Say something like may encourage?
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to really do that here, but I think just in general, I'm in favor of the concept that's proposed.
Commissioner Fisher? Chair Pepe?
Yeah.
Yes, I would be in agreement with it too. I'm also okay with not adding the words of encouraging or further changing it, but just kind of taking the staff's recommendation and having it contain where practicable, I think, is sufficient. Commissioner Sumler?
I agree.
Commissioner Whitman?
Yeah.
So that's the first change or modification, just through your consensus and straw poll voting. If you do ultimately recommend approval of the package here at the end, we would come back with findings and that section revised for your review with any other changes that you decide to make.
So that's the end of the,
That's the end.
no. Just that section, right? Right, next, shall the Secretary of Interior Standards for treatment of historic properties be added as additional criteria for minor and major alterations of landmarks? Commissioners?
Could you have it where if the property owner is currently listed on the National Register, and when listed on the National Register, they have to abide by the Secretary of the Interior standards, correct?
I'm sorry, again?
If there's a national, a home is on the National Register, or a building is on the National Registry, they have to abide by the Secretary of State.
Any property that
Right.
receives federal funding, correct?
Right. Could we have it where if the home is just listed with the City of Lake Oswego's list, they don't have to abide by that?
Well, I mean,
I mean, if they go for if they get to the City of Lake Oswego and the City of Lake Oswego approves them, and then they go for national, then they have to abide by
Yeah.
the Secretary of Interior. Or the reverse of that, they're already abiding by that.
what
But
we're
if they're
trying to
just
do
with-
is, though, is consolidate the code and make it simpler to review and use. And these are all just common sense requirements that are factors that are currently in the code, but they're just factors to consider. And so that becomes kind of ambiguous, and we lose a certain degree of certainty when we're applying factors to consider as opposed to criteria to follow.
But it would make the City of Lake Oswego's list more stringent than it currently is, correct?
Yeah, it might make it a little bit more stringent, but also more consistent because everybody would be following the same standards.
Help me understand that.
Well, I think that it's a little more ambiguous when you're applying the Secretary of Interior standards as factors to consider versus actual criteria that you must follow, because the factors may or may not come into play depending upon what situation you're in or what house
Do
you're
you
reviewing.
follow what Paul's saying? Right now, we have the Secretary of Interior language in our code, but they're basically guidelines.
Right.
And then our criteria are on top of that, and so I think the staff is having to essentially apply both without the certainty as to, which guidelines are going to apply to me, or
It's made it very confusing,
it's
yeah.
trying
But
to
that would,
streamline it.
but that would make it consistent with some of the other ones that we just approved, to where there is still some ambiguity. Would it not?
Well, in the areas that we have the opportunity to eliminate the ambiguity was the whole goal of writing the code to make it more clear.
I think, I'm sorry, maybe I'm missing the boat here, but I think you're making a dichotomy between the landmarks that are on the National Registry, apply the standards, the Secretary of Standard Interior to them, because they're on the National Registry, and that sort of thing. But if the landmark is not on the National Registry, then these would not be applied to them. Was that your?
Right, and that's what we were just going back and forth on, yeah.
And so staff's position is, we'd rather, for consistency purposes, not have to do the filter of whether they're on the National Registry or not, and determining what the criteria is, but that's.
Well, we think the guidelines are, the Secretary of Interior guidelines are clearer, and we think that they're more relevant to the review of these landmarks. I think that's the.
It would also limit the ability for any of the houses on the national or on the local inventory or hinder their ability to receive federal funding in the future if they haven't followed those Secretary of Interior standards to begin with. And so really, I mean, those standards are there to help people rehabilitate their house in such a fashion so that they are eligible for that funding in the future, and so that we don't make that mistake at the outset by not applying those standards or applying them inconsistently and not ununiformly.
Commissioner Stewart?
So are the Secretary of Interior standards, are they good enough to function themselves as the sole criteria? Or is there, I guess, are you asking here to only require compliance with the Secretary of Interior standards?
We're asking to add the Secretary of Interior standards to the existing criteria that we have because they're slightly different from what the standards have.
Okay, so your local standards, there's a few things that
There's a
the
few things that we
Secretary of
wanted to
Interior don't
retain in our
cover,
local
doesn't cover.
criteria as well.
And there are some provisions in the local standards today that are better articulated by the federal guideline or the federal standard. The language is clearer.
So this is more of a question, like an overall sweep and sort of deciding what's more appropriate to use then. Maybe.
We say it's it's maintenance.
Yeah.
Housekeeping.
Code maintenance.
Right. Right, I think what we're trying to do is just achieve consistency with the way most other jurisdictions with a complement of historic buildings apply their code criteria. And
Okay, so by doing this, this will make the code easy and the standards easier to use?
I think they're a lot easier to apply if they're standards as opposed to ambiguous factors to consider, yes.
Okay.
And if you have a mix of standards and factors to consider in your review criteria, it becomes very confusing as a staff person to first of all review and do the analysis for something like this, and then also explain to the property owner.
Commissioners, do we want to give a polling then? Shall the commission recommend using the Secretary of Interior standards for treatment of historic properties be added as additional criteria? Commissioner Whitman? Commissioner Sumler?
Yes.
Yes. Vice Chair Pepe?
Yes.
Fisher?
Yes.
Yes, unanimous. Next is policy issue 50.06009. Requires new construction that is a major or minor development, that the reviewing authority must find that the design of the proposed structure or alteration is complementary in appearance but does not mimic the design of the landmark on the site. Comments, commissioners? Commissioner Fisher?
I'm still confused about does not mimic. Can't you build a modern house that looks like an old house?
If it's outside of a historic district, sure, of course. But if it's within a historic district, and this actually is a part of the Secretary of Interior standards, is that they use the word conjecture. And so they don't want a conjectural building that's built in a district to exactly mimic in a way that you would see maybe the houses as you're walking down Main Street in Disneyland. Kind of the same, it's almost kind of the same effect. And what they don't want to have that kind of, I'm looking for the words for that, but I don't think they want to have that kind of consistency in a historic district. They want it a little bit different. And if it's a new building, then again, it can have the architectural elements of the period, but it should be very clear that the house was built during this current time period in order to discern the difference between when the house was actually built. So in other words, you don't want to have a house that looks like it was built in 1908, exactly like it was built in 1908. You want to be able to know, when you look at the house, that yes, it did have 1908 features, but it was built today. Does that help? I know it's really esoteric and it's kind of weird in a way, but.
Because if it's too close, if it's mimicking or it's duplicating an historic structure, it's diminishing the quality or the value of that structure. It's more about the historic landmark that we're trying to protect than it is the new structure that
Right.
we're not necessarily concerned with it being historic. Well, it's in an historic district, so it has to follow the guidelines. But we're not, I think to maintain the significant structure, you don't want to detract from it.
Vice Chair Pepe?
Back to me, I just lost my train of thought.
Commissioner
This
Stewart?
is only in a historic district.
So I
And
think.
this is really about,
We don't have one.
this is really about the district and how the district should actually look. And so you have houses that have a high degree of historic integrity that were built at a certain time period within that district that qualifies that district to be what it is. So, and while you can add new buildings there, they don't want to have conjectural mimicry
Yeah, I think
of
what
the
you
existing
have to zero in on is complementary. And complementary describes issues of scale, proportion, color, window treatment, things like that.
Yeah.
Those things can complement historic design without mimicking it,
Exactly.
right? So that, that's what they're after here, if that makes sense.
Right, and actually, Deputy City Attorney put it better than any of us. Said, really, the point is you want to be able to tell what is historic and what is not.
Yeah.
And that's the main point, so credit goes to Evan.
Vice Chair Pepe?
What's the threshold for a historical district as far as having that approved within the geographic boundary and who lives there or works or property owners?
I believe it's more than 2/3 of the people within the district requesting.
Well, yes, but I think you're quite, there's,
I'm trying to,
the majority of the parcels contain structures eligible for landmark designation. And then there's the property owner approval.
that's what I was referring to, yeah.
Which, let's see, looking through here. Resource.
I think that only 1/3 is needed to make an application.
Is
Yeah,
that
but I
1/3?
thought the threshold was higher. Hoping it's higher than 1/3.
Well, that's just to, I guess what I'm thinking is just to make the actual application, put the application forward.
Criteria for designation.
Maybe this question can be tabled until the next time we get together, but based on the fact that we're creating a new code for a historical district that does not exist right now, getting an understanding of what those requirements are and the qualifications are for that historical district.
Excuse me, that's in 5007-004. If anybody can get to that quickly, because that's a new application. Section landmark, criteria for materials, 5703. Here we are. If adding properties, it's 1/3 to make application. Not less than 1/3 of the privately owned property in the area sought to be designated may initiate the creation or modification of a historic district. Then, so that initiates it. Then HRAB would have to find that a half of the properties in that district are landmark in order to make a district.
So when you say HRAB would have to identify half?
Half.
Okay, are landmark, that means that they are either in City of Lake Oswego's landmark designation?
Yes.
Or national?
City of Lake Oswego's landmark. So they've already been designated as landmarks. Draw your boundaries. Half of them and 1/3 of the property owners say, let's make a historical district to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Commissioners, ready to make a recommendation for this that would require new construction that is major or minor development, that the reviewing authority must find that the design of the proposed structure or alteration is complementary in appearance, but does not mimic. Commissioners, are we for this? Commissioner Whitman? Commissioner Simler?
I guess I'm just wondering if there should be some clarification in terms of, because when I read this, it seems like you're almost building a brand-new property, and even though it's, you know, there's something that does not mimic the design of on-site, is there some clarification that should be made within this, that it's not ground up, brand new, but it's only an addition, or maybe that's clear to others, but it's not necessarily clear to me. Is anyone else feeling that way or not?
It actually does at the beginning say new construction, then later on says gives alteration as an option.
But this isn't necessarily that it's a virgin site that you're building a brand-new house, right? That it's only an addition or alteration. New construction to me sounds like absolutely ground up.
I guess what's the intent? Is it the intent to be either or or just new construction?
To me, I think this would be not ground up, it's only an addition, it's specifically to an existing property. That's only an addition, not ground up.
So does this apply
think
to
it's-
new structures and additions, or only new
I think it just
structures?
applies to the new structures.
What page is that on, or what?
Not for
We're looking at
alterations.
page 42, 42 of the attachment two.
Well, I think the review criteria, though, would be almost the same. I mean, if you're in a historic district, still want the complementary aspect.
Sure, but I guess to me, what's kind of strange is that, yeah, it says,
Right.
but does not mimic the design of the landmark that's on the site. So whether you raise the entire structure and then start new, and it shouldn't mimic it, versus if you're just doing an alteration, it should
Well,
be
you
complementary,
shouldn't-
but it shouldn't
Yeah, you
mimic.
shouldn't be mimicking regardless, though.
Right, I take the landmark on the site, meaning within that historical district, you can't mimic a landmark that's on that site.
Okay, I'm taking site as site-specific, that specific lot, not necessarily district or
Yeah,
region.
no, it's,
Yeah.
we're talking historical district, so whatever
So should,
landmarks in that district, you can't come near that.
sure, so should it be district and not site?
Chair, we were looking at this section, and I think the comment.
I would agree with that.
The comment was on page 42 of attachment 2, and this section C, subsection C, is criteria for new construction, and what it's striking out other than alterations. New construction of non-contributing resources within a historic district, and then under little I, it says the design of the proposed structure, says or the alteration, but we're thinking that it shouldn't say
Yeah,
or the alteration.
I think
we deal with alterations of a contributing resource on page 35. So we don't deal with alterations of non-contributing resources. And Paul, what, we got the double strikeout here. Should alterations of existing non-contributing resources be reviewed for complementary in appearance to the historic district? If the existing if the non-contributing resource is not complementary to the district, you wouldn't review the alteration to make sure it's complementary to the district.
Right.
You know, so I don't,
We're thinking that that should be.
right, that
strike
alteration
out.
should go out. The question that I raised with Paul here is, currently, this says you're gonna consider, when you're doing new construction of non-contributing resource within a historic district, you're going to review it for its complementariness with historic resource, only if it's a minor or major development. Now, what that means to us lawyers here is, if I have a building permit, I just want to build my house, I'm not asking for any variances, no rids, no nothing, this standard doesn't apply. I can build my house as a non-contributing resource in a historic district, not be complementary to the district, okay? If I want to get a setback variance or some other rid provision, that's a minor development, and then I would have to be complementary to the historic district. That doesn't seem, the relationship of the setback variance to the district complementariness doesn't seem rational to me. So
Right.
that question is, should we require the complementariness to be for all construction, new construction, all new construction, building permit or minor development, or eliminate it for setbacks and rids when it's just a minor development? I'll just say parenthetically, the major development is really just an ODPS, which is frankly never going to occur, or overall development plan schedule, which is never going to occur in a historic district. That's for, like Merrillhurst was built under an ODPS, phase construction, lock in the time, the code for 20 years kind of thing. So, you know, so you're never going to see really a major development. So we're really just talking about, should a property that has a variance or a rid have to be complementary, but not straight building permits? Okay? So that's one question I'd like to get
answered that was proposed.
Vice Chair Pepe, and answer.
Can I propose, maybe this question, you guys take this back and relook at it? And
That's
maybe we
fine.
look at it at the next meeting? I mean, we're coming across 3 or 4 of these questions. They're different on the screen than what they are in the packet. And it's really starting to get, at least for me, it's starting to get confusing.
Perfectly understandable.
But to your point, Boone, there is the case, because we just talked about, or we just passed allowing municipal buildings and extending their time frame within,
5 years or something. I mean,
yeah, help refresh my
you're
memory.
about the expiration of the development.
Right, so if we took the first edition, Forest Hills Elementary School could theoretically be within that district, and so then it would have your example that you were just talking about regarding Merrillhurst, where it's a phased development. That then could apply, wouldn't it?
Well, if you're within a historic district, of course, which we're not, we don't have any. Yeah,
Not yet.
Would a school district do an ODPS on an elementary school building? They haven't yet on any of their properties.
Right.
They tend to just build, to the population now, and then 10 years
Okay.
later, they think of what they want to do. And ODPS says, I know what I want to do, but I don't want to do it all
Lengthen
at
it out.
once. I need to do it over 20 years because my market demand, I can't fill it.
Gotcha, okay.
Well, that just doesn't really apply.
I think we're way
Yeah.
off track. And really the key issue, which
We-
you began to, started to illuminate for us, Evan, is just a single-family home, just say as an example, on a lot in this new district that the city's created or the neighborhood's created, wouldn't be going through this type of discretionary review. Is it complementary in appearance? Is it meeting these criteria for new construction? It's not an historic landmark, it's not a significant structure that's being altered, it's a new structure that's being built. So really the only way that this compatibility and appearance criterion would apply is if, I think your example, Evan, is if they were applying for a variance or something that took it through the land use process. And your point was, well, a variance to a setback has absolutely nothing to do with, the architectural quality. Now, if they're proposing a taller building than what the code allows and they're going through a variance process for that, that might be something different, something else than a setback. So we are more than happy to take this back and study it further and bring back to you some options or some refinements to this. If it's a substantial change to what's proposed, then you may wish to reopen your hearing. But I think really the key issue here is that we need to resolve that there's a conflict in here the way that it's
Yeah,
drafted.
the new construction alteration.
New
and
construction
the,
Right. I mean, having the question that we're looking at the screen be that of what's in the document as well.
Yes, so we're more than happy to take that back and clarify that, bring it back.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, do we want to move to the next question? Property maintenance,
So this is, the demolition by neglect section.
should the city adopt a property maintenance requirement for historic landmark structures to prevent the neglect of a landmark? Commissioner Stewart?
The only thing that makes me nervous about this is if this becomes kind of a requirement or a policy in the city, it might actually encourage homeowners to delist rather than have to grapple with this.
Commissioner Fisher?
Again, I'm asking the staff, what will this do to your, are you going to be the ones who enforce this? How is it going to be enforced?
Yeah, it would fall under code enforcement, And it really, the impact depends on the inspection program or regime that's, put into place. If it's a complaint-based process, then, at that point, it might be too late to try to help the property owner to abate the situation. If we're inspecting properties quarterly or, once a year, let's say, probably wouldn't be, well, how many? We've got 70. Not all of those are private property, but, consider, 2 to 4 hours a property for an inspection and for documenting what we're looking at. We're talking about a couple hundred hours of someone's time, not to mention the administrative support and everything else. So it's not an insignificant amount of time. Again, going back to the different options and the ways the city would carry out something like this, it was suggested in the testimony from the chair of ADJOURNMENT that there could be expertise out in the community that the city could contract with, and that would be a win-win potentially, for historic preservation supporters in Lake Oswego and the city. So I think, there's certainly some options. It's more of a resource or a budgetary issue for the city council to consider. We're more than happy to bring that to them if the planning commission's recommending, that we adopt the code change.
But Director Siegel, would there be any concerns with the legal delegation of authority? I think when we've looked at other sections of the code in the past, we've had to update our code to say that we couldn't defer it to the neighbor saying that it was okay.
No,
Is this different than deferring to a neighbor if we actually have HRAB or?
No, I wouldn't be delegating any authority because we would be using the volunteers to gather information, for the city. The city ultimately would be responsible for enforcing the code. It's not unlike the process that we have now, but it's more reactionary or reactive, when there's a complaint or someone in the community observes, a code violation, whether it's tree cutting or a fence is built too high, we get phone calls. In this case, be more proactive. We would have volunteers out, looking, and of course, it would only be exterior, unless the property owners, and unless the property owners offered to have someone onto their property, it would only be from the street, typically.
Thank you. Vice Chair Pepe?
What's the protocol when you're on the national registry? How do they monitor and police that?
For maintenance, I don't know if they do.
Yeah.
It's all up to the state.
But is there a demolition by neglect type of requirement?
Nope.
No.
Nope, the state implies that they rely on local jurisdictions to monitor all the properties on the National Register because presumably they are usually on the local inventories.
So the National Registry relies on the state to monitor, and the state relies on the local?
No. The state relies on local jurisdictions to monitor National Register properties because they're usually on the local inventory.
Oh, they're on both lists, is what you're saying?
Right, they're usually on both lists. We're talking about 5 properties in our jurisdiction that aren't. So they're in limbo in terms of, who watches them.
And so as far as what are we watching for, right now, the only thing that we're responding to is if there's a demolition without a permit. That's what we're able to enforce. If someone demolishes a home, whether it's historic or not, without a permit, then there's a violation. With this, it's stepping it up and saying, we're trying to preempt that or prevent that by enforcing a level of maintenance and care of the property before it falls into demolition by neglect.
Are there a lot of demolitions that take place without a permit?
No.
So are we creating something and trying to monitor something that's not necessarily a big issue?
Well, you asked the question about dangerous building, and a thought does come to my mind about the distinction between this. I think this would allow the city, as I said, to go in and ultimately either fine, which both dangerous building does, or remedy the structural deficiency and then lien the property. I think under a dangerous building standard, we just evacuate the building, put up no vacancy, and seal the property. And if it becomes a dangerous building,
I mean, we might put a fence up, you know, we're not gonna go in and restore the building to a status so that it's no longer structurally deficient. We're just gonna protect the public nuisance, so it's not an attractive nuisance, doesn't hurt anybody. Ultimately, I suppose we might end up having to demolish it, you know, if it really is a structural defect, which would cause public harm. But this says, I think that it would be a public nuisance and we'd want to restore the structural defect, remove the structural defect. So that's a difference between the dangerous building code and this.
Yeah, the dangerous building code is a safety concern. The building official enforces that. This is a land use concern about aesthetics and historic resources, and it probably doesn't have it doesn't have the resources that the building department has for safety issues.
Yeah, it's aesthetics, but I mean, it's preserving the Goal 5 inventoried resource as opposed to just preserving safety. So I could see a difference.
Commissioners, can we make a recommendation? Mr. Whitman?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Long term, doesn't really seem to be a problem, but could be.
Commissioner Summer?
I think I'm going to say no, because it sounds like it's not an issue. It sounds like most people who are in the landmark status take care of their homes already, and very few are neglected. I would hate to reallocate resources or something.
I would vote for it.
I want to vote for it. I'm in line with Commissioner Sumlin on, we don't know what it's going to cost. We don't know how many resources it's going to take in order to monitor this. It doesn't sound like it's that big of an issue to begin with. I think probably the bigger issue is neglect of a building, of an older building that probably should be on the historical registry of some sort. But because they neglect it, then you demolish it. And we've talked about that in previous sessions. So for this one, I just can't get on board.
I agree that it's an issue that doesn't seem to be an issue right now, but it could be, and so why not? I'll vote for it.
Commissioner Stewart?
Yeah, I go back to what you said earlier. This seems to be more of an issue for code enforcement than for necessarily maybe planning staff to do or maintain.
Well, we're one and the same. So code enforcement is general fund. It's in the planning department. Again, that's not a planning commission question, funding or budget, but it's but you want to look at the code and say, is this enforceable? Is this going to, create more problems than it's going to solve, or are we going to prevent more problems than, would be created otherwise? That's the policy issue.
I don't know that I would support this.
So no, so it seems like split 3-3. I'm not sure if that
Yeah,
helps.
there's nothing
staff.
wrong with, and I don't know, at the next meeting, perhaps the other commissioners might rethink it, or, do we have a seventh commissioner? Yeah, not here. Yeah, so he could break the tie. All this is a recommendation to city council, so it could be referred to the council on a 4-3 split, or a 3-3 tie.
Okay. Next, Paul?
I think that's the end of it.
That's it.
Okay.
That's the last one. Thank you.
Thank you, commissioners, for going through that lengthy process, but I think it was a good discussion. So thanks to everyone, thanks to staff.
Yeah, you bet.
Thanks to Chair Green for coming tonight and giving excellent testimony. Thank you.
So what do we do now? Are we continuing this, or do we know enough?
have another meeting.
Hearing to come back to you, particularly on the issue about the new construction of non-contributing resources or alterations, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
At least that. And then I think there's some other language cleanup.
One or two other questions too.
And so, Chair, if it's all right with you, we would come back on the 9th of March and continue the discussion.
Sure. And just for clarification, the public testimony would be closed? Is that the recommendation for that? Commissioners, I don't know if you want to chime in. I think, yeah, we've taken public testimony already. I think it's just clarification of what the commission has asked. The recommendation would be to not take public testimony at the next meeting, but just try to close on the opens that we've taken from tonight.
So a motion to continue to March March the 9th for deliberation purposes only would be in order.
Right? Somebody,
So moved.
all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We kind of talked at the same, I can second it. We kind of talked at the same time.
Yeah.
Director Siegel, would you like to continue on with the agenda then? Other business?
Other business, we have a schedule update, if that's what you're looking for.
Yes, so no other business, and I guess we can go to the schedule review, yes.
Okay.
One question I had on schedule review, Director Siegel, was last council session, I think it was the last council session, they basically reviewed the sustainability and climate action plan. How will that impact our schedule, and how does it fit in with that? Maybe you already have an answer for that.
Yeah, good timing or good question, actually. So as you mentioned, the city council did give, well, they reviewed the sustainability action plan. I think they're scheduled to take final action on that at a future meeting. We've tentatively scheduled a work session with you on April 27th, at which time I thought we would be ready, or the council would have finalized their decision, and we can pick up where you left off and looking at the final version of the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan to see, what action items are for the Planning Commission to work on. So if that still sounds like a good approach, we'll plan on picking it up.
That sounds excellent. So finally, the commission's getting cleared, I guess, to start looking at that. We've been kind of blocked on waiting for council to give this kind of approval. So we're clearing a roadblock, which is excellent. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, good news there. On March 9th, you've got the 5th and what we believe may be the final work session on the citizen involvement guidelines update, but we'll see. The hearing on that is tentatively scheduled for April 27th, so I think we are getting close. The public review draft that had been out for comments before your last meeting on this, as you'll recall, the commission extended the review period for that, and the planning staff has been reaching out to the neighborhood associations. And so what we'd like to do is encourage the neighborhoods that are taking a more active role on this to provide their comments to you for the work session on the 9th, and see where we go from there, see how close we are on the revisions. The Historic Preservation Code, so we'll come back as you've continued your hearing, closed to testimony, but continued your hearing on that for the 9th. And we'll also have an update on House Bills 2001 and 2003. The state rulemaking process is ongoing, and there's a lot of information, coming out of that process. I think it is, I think we've seen a first draft of one of the model ordinances for the smaller cities, or what they're calling the medium-sized cities, and the requirement that they allow duplexes, or that all cities of that size or larger allow duplexes. And so the report that Eric Olson had put out for your last meeting basically brought us up to date and to the point that we're at now. I think by your March 9th meeting, we'll have some new information. It'll be probably have some more guidance on the infrastructure issues that we've discussed, as well as the House Bill 2003 requirements around housing production strategies. Those two committees have, I don't think they had met prior to the last report, and they have been meeting, so there should be some more information on that. And then on the second meeting, and what would have been the second meeting in March, it sounds like from the quorum check, I don't think you have a quorum, do you? Or
I think it was at risk. That was one of my questions too. I was going to say, based on the analysis that you provided, Iris, my recommendation would be not to hold that second meeting in March because it doesn't look like we're going to have quorum. It would be extremely risky. Some commissioners said they might be able to come back just to establish quorum, but my recommendation, based on the feedback that we got, would be not to have the second meeting in March that goes over spring break, as we've not held that meeting in the past too, for those reasons.
Yeah, we understood that date was questionable, and we just thought we would put it out there and see if the commissioners We're going to be in town. It is spring break.
My only concern there, Director Siegel, would it impact any of the critical work that we need to do for
No, we
council or
can
timelines or
actually-
anything like
yeah,
that?
We can actually work around that.
Okay.
And so
Yeah, I
no
think it's fine,
problem.
yeah.
I appreciate you asking. The updates on, or the update on the Cruiseway Traffic Management Code, that'll just shift to the next meeting. That was just to be an update on basically the scope and the process. The work on the flood hazard overlay, that is actually going to give us a little bit more time. We've been working with the State Department of Land Conservation and Development and want to make sure that we're on the right track with the code amendments that we're scoping. So that's actually happening next week. I think, Evan, you're going to be discussing that with DLCD and our floodplain administrator with the city. So if that could shift, that work session on the flood hazard overlay could shift to the 13th of April, that would be just fine from our perspective.
Great.
And that's it through March and April. As I said, the Sustainability Climate Action Plan will be starting up on that again, second meeting in April. So unless you have any other questions or want other updates, I can conclude with that.
Okay, no other questions from commissioners. Thank you, and I'd like to adjourn the meeting. Meeting adjourned.